Hey guys, tonight, we're diving into one of the most chilling and infamous true stories that still sends shivers down the spines of those who dare to uncover its secrets. Picture this, an eerie old house in the quiet suburbs, its windows dark like empty eyes hiding a sinister past. The air heavy, the atmosphere thick with a lingering sense of dread. What could possibly go wrong, right? You probably won't survive this one. But hey, don't say I didn't warn you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had been nothing more than a dream for the Lutz family. A sprawling colonial home with its grand facade and perfectly manicured lawn sat nestled in a quiet Long Island neighborhood. When George and Kathy Lutz bought the house, they had no idea that it was more than just a charming fixer-upper. To them, it was a fresh start, a place where they could build a new life with their children. But there was something about the house, something that lurked beneath its surface that would change their lives forever. The Lutz family moved in just a few weeks after the DeFeo murders. Ronald DeFeo Jr. had brutally slaughtered his parents and 4 siblings in the middle of the night, but that's not where the horror truly began. The details of those murders were shocking, but the real story unfolded when the Lutz family took up residence in what had once been a quiet, ordinary house. From the very beginning, strange things began happening. At first, it was subtle, faint noises at night, odd drafts and cold spots in rooms that should have been warm. But as the days passed, the phenomena grew more intense, more dangerous. The walls seemed to groan as if they were alive, and whispers could be heard in the empty corners of the house, a strange guttural voice that sent chills down Kathy's spine. The family brushed it off as nothing more than the natural creaks and groans of an old house. But deep down, they knew something wasn't right. It was hard to ignore the feeling that something was watching them. Something unseen, something ancient. The feeling wasn't confined to just one room. It was everywhere. The kitchen, the living room, the stairs. It was as if the entire house was alive, breathing, waiting. But the most unsettling part was the feeling that the house wanted them there, wanted them to stay. One night, as the family gathered in the living room, Kathy felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward the front door. She stood up and made her way toward it, without even realizing what she was doing. George called after her, asking what was wrong. But Kathy didn't hear him. She stepped outside into the cold, dark night as if she were in a trance. By the time George caught up with her, Kathy was standing in the front yard staring at the house. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth slightly agape as if she was seeing something he couldn't. Something that no one could see. "What's wrong?" George asked, his voice trembling. Kathy shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't explain what she felt, what she had seen, but there was no mistaking the look of sheer horror on her face. The house had called to her, and now it had taken control. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just a home that had been the site of a horrific crime. It was a vessel, a dark, malevolent force that seemed to feed off the fear and suffering of those who entered its walls. And it wanted the Lutz family. It wanted them to stay, to be part of its twisted story. For days, the strange occurrences continued. Objects would move by themselves, slamming into walls or shifting from one room to another. Doors that had been locked would suddenly open on their own, and the family could hear footsteps above them when no one was there. The temperature in the house fluctuated wildly. One room would be freezing cold, while another would be suffocatingly hot. At night, the Lutz family would hear the sound of faint laughter, a childlike giggle coming from the dark corners of the house. But when they checked, no one was there. Kathy, who had always been the more sensitive one, started having vivid, terrifying dreams. She would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, her heart racing, as if something had been standing over her, watching her. And then there were the smells, the distinct odors of decay and rot that seemed to come from nowhere, lingering in the air for hours at a time, only to disappear as mysteriously as they had appeared. One night, George was alone in the house preparing dinner while the children played outside. He was chopping vegetables in the kitchen when he heard something, a faint sound, like someone was calling his name. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it happened again. He turned expecting to see one of the kids standing in the doorway, but there was nothing there. He tried to shake it off, but the sound persisted closer now, more insistent. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from inside the walls. The hair on the back of George's neck stood up. He had no idea what was happening, but it was clear to him now that whatever this thing was, it was not going to stop until it had claimed them all. The house was feeding off their fear, and the more they resisted, the stronger it became. It was only a matter of time before the Lutz family would either succumb to the house's will or flee. But there was something else, something darker, something more terrifying that they had yet to discover. The days grew darker as the events inside the house escalated. The Lutz family found themselves trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake up from. Every corner of the house felt like it was closing in on them. It wasn't just the physical space, it was the atmosphere. The air thick with an oppressive, suffocating energy. It seemed as though the house itself was trying to crush their spirits to break them down until they were nothing but husks of their former selves. The most disturbing of all was the way the house seemed to twist and distort time. George and Kathy noticed that days would pass in what felt like hours. They would go to bed at what they thought was 10 p.m., only to wake up to find it was already 3 a.m. The hours lost as if they were slipping through their fingers were just another sign of how far they were from reality. One morning, as the sun began to set, Kathy had the overwhelming feeling of being watched. She glanced out of the kitchen window and froze. There, in the reflection of the glass, was a shadow standing at the foot of the stairs. The figure was tall, its outline twisted and almost inhuman, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. But when Kathy turned to look, there was nothing there. "George," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I saw something outside in the reflection." George, though, already unnerved by the strange happenings, brushed it off. "It's just your imagination, Kathy. Maybe you're just tired. We all are." But Kathy wasn't convinced. There was something in the way that shadow had moved so unnatural, so deliberate. The reflection seemed too clear, too real to be dismissed as a trick of the light. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, George found himself standing in the living room staring at the fireplace. He couldn't quite explain it, but he felt drawn to it, as though something was calling him, urging him to come closer. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the flickering flames, when suddenly the air grew thick with the smell of something foul like burnt meat. He recoiled, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could move, he heard it. A low, guttural growl rising from the depths of the fireplace. It was a sound that sent terror coursing through his veins, a sound that he knew deep down was not meant for human ears. Kathy's voice broke through the haze of fear. "What's happening?" George didn't answer. He couldn't. He could barely even move as the growl became louder, more ferocious. His body felt frozen, as if the very air around him had solidified, trapping him in place. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The house fell silent again, save for the soft crackling of the fire. It was the silence that was the most terrifying. There was no longer any comfort in the flickering flames, no warmth to be found. The house was awake now, alive in a way that no one could understand, its very walls pulsing with malevolent energy. From that moment on, things only worsened. The family began to notice more and more disturbing occurrences, objects that would move when no one was around, furniture rearranging itself in the middle of the night, and a constant feeling of unease that lingered in every room. But it wasn't just the house that had changed, it was them. George had always been the rock of the family, the one who kept everything together. But now he found himself consumed by an overwhelming sense of dread. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. He would lie awake for hours, staring into the darkness, listening for the faintest sound of movement. And when he did sleep, the dreams were worse. He dreamed of the house of the walls closing in around him, of eyes staring out from the shadows, watching him waiting. Kathy, too, was becoming more and more withdrawn. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that someone or something was always behind her. She would hear footsteps behind her in the hall, but when she turned around, there was no one there. She would find herself standing in the middle of rooms, unsure of how she had gotten there, her mind clouded as if she were walking in a dream, but it was the children who were the most affected. The youngest Missy seemed to be the most sensitive to the house's dark influence. She would often speak to someone invisible, her conversations sounding eerily normal, as if she were speaking to an old friend. But there was no one there. The family began to realize that Missy wasn't just imagining things. She was communicating with something that had been there long before they had arrived. One night after the children had gone to bed, Kathy was sitting in the living room, trying to make sense of everything that had been happening. She had been on edge all day, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. As she sat there staring into the darkness, she heard it again, the faint whispering. It was coming from upstairs. Slowly, Kathy stood up, her heart thudding in her chest. She crept toward the stairs, listening closely. The whispering was louder now, clearer. It was the same voice she had heard before, that guttural, otherworldly voice calling to her, beckoning her to come upstairs. "No," she muttered to herself, shaking her head. "No, I'm not going up there." But the voice didn't stop. It only grew more insistent, more demanding. Kathy felt the pull, the irresistible urge to go upstairs to see what lay waiting for her in the darkness. With a shudder, she turned and fled from the house, the whispers echoing in her ears as she ran. The night air outside was cold, the kind of cold that sinks deep into your bones, but Kathy didn't care. She kept running, her feet pounding the pavement, the faint whispers still echoing in her mind. She didn't look back. She couldn't look back. The house had already claimed too much of her, too much of them. As she reached the end of the driveway, she stopped, gasping for breath, trying to shake off the feeling that was creeping up on her. The whispering had stopped, but its presence lingered in her mind, a heavy weight pressing on her chest. She turned to look at the house, at the dark windows, the empty door frame, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw something. A shadow. A figure standing at the window watching her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm just tired. I need sleep. That's all." But deep down, Kathy knew it wasn't just tiredness. The house had a hold on her, and it wasn't going to let go easily. She had felt it the moment they moved in. An energy, a force, something ancient and powerful. But now it was too late. The house had already started to work its magic, pulling them deeper into its darkness. George found her outside minutes later, breathless and pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Kathy, what's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "What happened?" Why did you run out here like that? She couldn't answer. Her throat was tight, her mind reeling with the whispers, the shadows, the overwhelming sense of something waiting for her. She looked at George, trying to make him understand, but the words wouldn't come. Kathy, talk to me. George insisted, gently grabbing her by the shoulders. We can get through this. We just need to stick together, all right? But Kathy's eyes darted back toward the house. There was no way she could go back in there. Not after what she had felt. Not after hearing those whispers. Not after seeing the figure at the window. We can't go back inside, she said, her voice trembling. There's something in there. Something. It's calling to me. I don't know how much longer I can fight it, George. George looked at her, confusion and fear crossing his face. He hadn't experienced what Kathy had, but he could feel the weight of her words. There was something off about that house. Something more than just the murders. Something that had been festering long before they ever arrived. He glanced toward the front door, its dark frame like a gaping mouth ready to swallow them whole. Something inside him, something primal and protective, told him they needed to leave. But then there was a pull, a nagging feeling, a whisper in his mind that told him to stay. We're not leaving, Kathy, George said softly, though his voice lacked conviction. We'll figure this out. We'll make it through. But Kathy knew better. The house had already begun to take them. Every moment they stayed in that place, they were losing pieces of themselves. The house had a way of manipulating the mind, of making you question reality, making you doubt your own perceptions. It wasn't long before the children began to notice something wasn't right. Missy, the youngest, had always been sensitive to the strange happenings, but now even the older kids were feeling it. The air in the house felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. They would wake up in the middle of the night, the sheets soaked with sweat, their hearts racing, their minds filled with dark dreams. But it was Missy who spoke the most about the things she saw. Mommy, Missy said one evening, her voice soft and eerie, the man with the red eyes is in the corner again. He's not happy. Kathy froze, her stomach dropping. The man with the red eyes. She had heard Missy talk about him before, but she had dismissed it as a child's imagination. But now, the terror in her daughter's voice told her that something was very wrong. Missy, sweetheart, what do you mean? Kathy asked, kneeling down to her daughter's level. He's mad, Missy whispered, her small voice trembling. He doesn't like when I talk to him. He's mad at you, Mommy. He says you can't leave. Kathy's blood ran cold. The man with the red eyes. It wasn't just a figment of Missy's imagination. Whatever was in that house was speaking to her, speaking to all of them. That night, the family stayed in the living room, huddled together on the couch, trying to feel safe in each other's company. But the house didn't care about safety. It didn't care about family. It cared only about feeding its darkness. The house began to show its true nature, no longer just strange occurrences or fleeting shadows, but a force that sought to tear them apart. George found himself waking up more and more often in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing. The shadows seemed to grow darker longer, and the whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves. But it was the voices that truly began to haunt them. Low, guttural whispers that spoke in languages they couldn't understand. The voices would come in the dead of night, whispering just behind their ears, telling them things they didn't want to hear. Threats, promises, insults. But the worst part, the voices weren't just in the house. They followed them no matter where they went. And soon, even the sound of their own thoughts seemed to drown under the weight of the whispers. One evening, George finally snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't let this house destroy them. But when he reached for his keys, he froze. There in the hallway just beyond the door to the living room stood a figure, tall, dark, shrouded in shadow. George reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. The figure stood there, unmoving, its eyes glowing a faint red. "Get out," the voice whispered, so soft yet so powerful that it shook George to his core. George froze. His breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he had feared. The house had finally revealed its true face. And it wasn't just the house. It was something far worse. The figure in the hallway didn't move, but its presence was undeniable. George's heart hammered in his chest as he stood frozen, his hand still gripping the doorframe. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as though the air itself had thickened, holding him in place, suffocating him. The figure, its outline dark and indistinct, loomed in the hallway like a shadow that should not exist. But its eyes, those glowing red eyes, pierced the darkness. They weren't just any eyes. They burned with an ancient malevolence, a hatred so deep that it felt as if the very room around them was suffused with its evil. "Get out," the voice whispered again, its tone colder now, more insistent. "You don't belong here." George's breath caught in his throat, the chill of fear creeping up his spine. For a long moment, he stood still, unable to move, paralyzed by the force of the voice. The shadow moved then, just slightly, as if to emphasize its presence. But it didn't come closer. It didn't need to. It had already claimed him. "George." Kathy's voice was barely a whisper, but it pierced through the terror that gripped him. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She must have heard the voice too. "What's happening?" George didn't answer. He couldn't. His body was trembling, his hands cold as ice. He forced himself to take a step back, but the figure remained. It didn't flicker in and out like a mere ghost. No. This was something else, something darker, something far older than any of them could comprehend. The house seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, feeding off their terror. The temperature dropped even further, the air so thick with dread, it was hard to breathe. George could feel it pressing down on him, trying to crush him under the weight of its malice. Suddenly, the figure was gone. It vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the echo of its voice. "Get out," it had said, but now the house was still. The eerie silence was almost worse than the voice itself. George stared at the empty hallway, feeling as though the walls were closing in on him. He turned to Kathy, his expression one of disbelief. "Did you see that?" he asked, his voice strained. Kathy didn't answer immediately. Her face was a mask of shock, her eyes darting from the empty hallway to George and then to the children. "We need to leave," Kathy said finally, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here any longer. This place, it's not safe. It's never been safe." But even as she spoke, something deep inside, George resisted. He could feel it, the same pull, the same force that had driven them into this house in the first place. He wanted to leave. They all did. But there was something about the house, something about its presence that made him hesitate. "Maybe we should try to find out more." George muttered more to himself than to Kathy. "Maybe there's something in the history of this house we don't understand. Maybe it can be—" "No," Kathy interrupted him, her voice firm yet trembling. "There is no understanding this, George. It's evil, pure evil. We have to get out." Kathy's words seemed to finally break through the fog of fear that had clouded George's mind. He looked at her. Really, looked at her for the first time in what felt like days, and saw the same terror in her eyes that he felt in his chest. He realized then that there was no reasoning with the house. No amount of investigation, no amount of willpower would make them safe, but the house wasn't going to let them leave so easily. even as they made their way toward the door, the whispers returned low and insistent, filling the air with a soft, menacing murmur. The shadows seemed to move around them, as if the very walls of the house were alive, twisting, bending, trying to trap them. "Don't leave," the voice hissed closer now, as if it were breathing down their necks. "You belong here, forever." Kathy grabbed George's arm, her grip tight. "We have to go, now." They hurried toward the door, but as they reached for the handle, it wouldn't open. George twisted the knob desperately, but it was as if the door had fused with the frame, refusing to budge. Sweat poured down his face as panic gripped him. "It's locked," he shouted. "We're trapped." Behind them, the house seemed to respond. The walls groaned, a low, echoing sound that reverberated through the floorboards. Then the smell of decay washed over them so strong that it burned their nostrils. It was the smell of death, of something long forgotten, trapped in the walls of the house for years, waiting for them. No, Kathy screamed, but it was too late. The lights flickered, then went out completely. They were plunged into darkness. The only sound was the rapid beating of their hearts, the soft shuffle of their feet as they backed away from the door. They were trapped. The house was closing in around them, cutting off their escape. And then the whispering started again, this time louder, filling the entire house. It was everywhere, inside their heads, in their ears, in their hearts. The walls seemed to pulse with life, a malevolent energy that wrapped itself around them, pulling them deeper into its grasp. "You cannot leave," the voice whispered, this time so close it felt as if it was speaking directly into their minds. "You are mine." The temperature dropped even further until George and Kathy could see their breath in the air, the cold biting into their skin. But they were no longer concerned with the cold. They were concerned with the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that had filled the house, the certainty that no matter how hard they tried, they could not escape. The house would never let them go. Kathy turned to George, her face pale, her voice barely a whisper. "We need to get out of here, George. Please. Before it's too late." But George didn't answer. He was staring at something in the corner of the room, his face frozen in fear. Kathy turned to look, and her heart stopped. There, standing in the corner, was the figure again. This time, it was clearer, no longer a shadow, but a solid, horrific presence. Its red eyes glowed even brighter now, burning with an intensity that seemed to burn through them both. "Get out," the figure said one last time, its voice no longer a whisper, but a roar that shook the very foundation of the house. The last thing Kathy and George saw was the figure lunging toward them, its eyes wide with malice, before everything went black. When Kathy awoke, it wasn't to the comforting embrace of sleep, but to a nightmarish reality that was somehow worse than the nightmare itself. Her eyes fluttered open, but everything was blurry, like she had just awoken from a deep, unnatural slumber. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus, but the darkness around her seemed to press in from all sides. It felt like the very air had thickened, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. For a moment she thought she was still in the living room, still trapped in that horrifying nightmare where the shadows and whispers had no end. But when she tried to sit up, she found that she couldn't. Her limbs were heavy, as though they were weighed down by something far greater than mere fatigue. Her head spun with dizziness, her body trembling uncontrollably, and for a second she wondered if she had somehow become trapped in a dream within a dream. Then, as her vision cleared, she saw it. The walls, once familiar, were now warped, twisted in ways that made her stomach churn. The edges of the room seemed to be bending inward, drawing her closer to the center, as if the house itself was trying to swallow her whole. "Kathy," came George's voice, low and filled with fear. She turned toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. He was there, sitting on the floor beside her, his face pale and drawn, his clothes torn. He looked just as disoriented as she felt, but his eyes held a deep, unmistakable terror. I don't know what happened, George said, his voice strained. I remember the figure. It came for us. And then it just went dark. Kathy nodded slowly, her mind reeling. She couldn't fully remember the details, but the echoes of the house's haunting whispers, the eyes of the figure, the overwhelming feeling of dread, they were all still with her, as though they had never left. The air still felt thick, oppressive, as if the house had invaded every fiber of her being. But something was different. Something had changed. I thought we were gone, Kathy whispered, her voice shaking. I thought it was the end, George. I thought we couldn't escape. George's gaze turned toward the center of the room, and his face grew even more fearful. Kathy, we didn't escape. We're still here. Kathy followed his gaze, and her breath caught in her throat. The room around them had shifted the walls. Now pressed impossibly close, the space between them and the door narrowing with each passing second. It was as though the house was trying to erase them, to make them part of its twisted architecture. We need to leave, Kathy, said her voice, a desperate whisper, but George didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on something she couldn't see, his body frozen, his face expressionless. She reached out to him, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. George, she asked again, more forcefully this time. He didn't respond at first. His eyes were wide, staring at something just beyond her. Slowly, his lips parted, and he spoke, his voice hoarse. They're here. Kathy's stomach churned. Who? The air grew colder, and she felt it. Then the unmistakable presence of something behind her, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. She turned around, and there it was, the figure. It was standing just behind them, its eyes glowing a deep, unnatural red. It was taller now, more menacing, its body engulfed in darkness, like a void that threatened to devour everything in its path. The voice came again, this time louder, more commanding. You belong to me now. The words reverberated through the room, shaking the walls, vibrating in her very bones. Kathy could feel the truth of the words sinking into her soul. There was no escaping it. They had become part of the house, part of the evil that had taken root in the very foundation of the building. It was too late. The house had claimed them. George tried to move, but he was frozen in place, his face contorted in terror. Kathy could feel it too, this overwhelming, suffocating weight that kept them trapped, immobilized. They couldn't run. They couldn't escape. The house had them, and it wasn't going to let go. The figure moved closer, its presence becoming more tangible, more real with each step. Kathy tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, stifled by the pressure in the air. It wasn't just the figure that was closing in on them. It was the house itself, the very walls of the room shifting, narrowing in around them like a vice, squeezing the life from them with each passing second. Please, Kathy gasped, her voice barely a whisper. Please let us go. The figure's eyes burned brighter, and its lips curled into a wicked smile. It wasn't a human smile, but something far more monstrous, an expression of pure malice and hunger. You cannot leave it, hissed its voice, a low, guttural growl that reverberated in their chests. You were never meant to leave. Kathy felt the coldness seep into her skin, into her very bones, as if the house itself was trying to freeze her from the inside out. She tried to move, to scream, to fight back, but her body wouldn't respond. She could barely breathe, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The room returned to its unnatural stillness, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive, suffocating. Kathy collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, as if she'd been underwater for far too long. George remained frozen, his face a mask of terror, his eyes wide in disbelief. What just happened?" he whispered. Kathy didn't know. She didn't know if they had escaped, or if they had simply slipped deeper into the house's grip. But one thing was certain: they were no longer in control. The house had taken them, and it was only a matter of time before it finished what it had started. Kathy lay on the floor, struggling to breathe, her body shaking uncontrollably as the reality of what had just happened set in. The air around them felt thick, almost alive, pulsating with something dark, ancient, and malevolent. She could hear George's breath coming in short, shallow gasps beside her, but he too was trapped in the stillness of the moment, his face frozen in a mask of disbelief. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second a weight pressing down on their bodies. They couldn't move. They couldn't think. All they could do was lie there, paralyzed by the suffocating force that had gripped the house and by the knowledge that they were no longer in control. The house was not just a structure. It was a living thing, its heart beating with malevolent intent, pulsing through the very walls, suffusing the rooms with its darkness. For what felt like hours, neither Kathy nor George spoke. There were no words to be said, no comfort to be found in the silence that had fallen between them. Kathy's mind raced, but the terror that clouded her thoughts only made it harder to focus. She felt like she was losing herself to the house, like the very air around her was stealing pieces of her identity, pushing her into the abyss of its grip. And then finally George spoke, his voice trembling but filled with urgency. "We can't stay here. We have to leave, Kathy. We have to get out of here." Kathy's head snapped toward him, her eyes wide with terror. "George, we can't. The door is locked. It won't open. We've tried." "No," he cut her off, his voice firm, almost desperate. "We're not going to sit here and let it claim us. We've fought it before. We can fight it again." Kathy shook her head, the coldness of the room seeping into her thoughts. "It's too strong now, George. The house, it's not just a house anymore. It's something else. Something evil. It won't let us go. We can't escape." But George didn't listen. He stood, his legs unsteady, his face pale but resolute. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he took a step toward the door. "We won't know unless we try." Kathy wanted to stop him, wanted to pull him back, but she couldn't. The house wouldn't let her move either. The invisible grip that had held them in place now seemed to tighten around her chest, as if the walls themselves were trying to keep her from reaching out. She could feel it, the house feeding off her fear, growing stronger with every moment they spent in it. George reached the door and tried the handle again, but once more it didn't budge. He slammed his shoulder into it, trying with all his strength to force it open, but the door was as immovable as a mountain. "Damn it!" he shouted, slamming his fist into the door in frustration. His breath was coming faster now, panicked. The whispers started again, low, dissonant, and growing louder by the second. The sound seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the walls, pouring through the very air. It was the same voice that had haunted them from the beginning, the voice of the house itself, of whatever force lay at its heart. "You can't escape," the voice whispered, its tone dripping with malice. "You belong to me now. You are mine." Kathy covered her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers weren't just in her ears. They were inside her head, seeping into her thoughts, taking root in her mind. She could feel the house pushing in, pulling her toward it, toward its terrible, crushing presence. "We have to get out of here," George said again, more frantically now, his hands shaking as he pounded on the door. His voice was desperate, but there was something in it, something she hadn't heard before. A thread of certainty, of anger. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was determination. Kathy rose to her feet, slowly feeling the weight of the house's grip loosening slightly, just enough to allow her movement. She stepped forward, her legs unsteady beneath her, and joined George at the door. She grabbed the handle, her heart pounding, and together they pulled. It didn't open, but the house wasn't finished with them yet. The walls groaned again, louder this time. A deep, low rumble that made the floor beneath their feet tremble. The lights flickered, then went out, plunging them into complete darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, the air biting and cold, so cold that it hurt to breathe. Then, with a sound like cracking wood, the door finally gave way. It swung open with a violent force, slamming against the wall, and in that moment, the room seemed to inhale, drawing them into the darkness beyond. George didn't hesitate. He grabbed Kathy's arm and pulled her through the door, his feet moving faster than she thought possible, as though the house itself were trying to drag them back, to claw them into the depths from which they had no hope of escape. They ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing in the silent house. The walls seemed to close in around them as they moved, the hallway stretching longer and longer, twisting until they weren't sure if they were moving forward or backward. And then suddenly, they saw it. The front door. Just ahead, a sliver of light shining through the darkness, beckoning them forward. The door was open, as if waiting for them to escape, but the air in front of them thickened, and the shadows began to gather, swirling and twisting in the hallway, like a storm ready to consume them. The figure appeared again, standing in the doorway, its red eyes glowing brighter than ever. Its body, more solid, more real. "You cannot leave it," said its voice so deep and full of rage that it vibrated through the floorboards. "This house is your home now, and you are mine." Kathy froze, her heart in her throat. She wanted to run, to scream, to tear away from this nightmare, but her body wouldn't obey. George, too, was paralyzed, his body trembling in the presence of the figure. The house had them, and there was no escaping it. The figure's eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and as it stepped closer, the very air around them seemed to warp. It wasn't just the figure that was alive. It was the entire house. The walls pressed in the ceiling seemed to lower, and the floor beneath their feet shifted as if the house were alive, growing, pulsing with a dark, insatiable hunger. Kathy's chest tightened. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the figure moved toward them, its every step causing the room to vibrate with power. It was no longer a shadow, no longer a fleeting presence. It had taken form, becoming something tangible, something that could not be ignored, something that couldn't be reasoned with. She tried to move, to run, to break free from the oppressive hold of the house, but her feet felt rooted to the ground, heavy as stone. It was as if the very floor had become an extension of the house itself, holding her in place, keeping her captive. George was beside her, but he too seemed frozen, his eyes wide with terror as the figure came closer. His lips trembled, but he didn't speak. He couldn't. The suffocating presence of the house had stolen his voice, his will to fight. "No." Kathy whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. She shook her head, trying to clear the fog that clouded her thoughts. We can't stay here. We have to fight back." But the house wasn't listening. The house didn't care. It was already too late. They were its prisoners now. The figure's mouth twisted into a grin that was not human, a grin full of malice and hatred. It opened its mouth, and the voice that came out was not just one voice. It was hundreds, thousands of voices, all whispering at once, all speaking in a guttural, distorted chorus. "You belong to me." The voices said their words, overlapping, twisting together into a single unholy command. "This house is your home. You will never leave. Never." The whispers grew louder until they were all Kathy could hear. They surrounded her, filled her, crawled into her skin, and under her flesh, burrowing into her mind. She could feel herself slipping, her sense of self being pulled away piece by piece until she wasn't sure who she was anymore. "George?" She gasped, her voice cracking. "We need to get out. Please." But George wasn't looking at her. His eyes were wide, his expression distant. It was as if the house had already claimed him too. He stood there, his body trembling, but his face was blank, almost empty. Kathy reached for him, desperate. "George, please." The moment she touched his arm, she felt it. The pull. The force of the house grabbing hold of her, dragging her toward the figure, toward the darkness that had taken over the room. She felt her legs give way beneath her, her body pulled forward with an unnatural force. Her arms flailed, but it was no use. The house had taken her. There was no escaping it. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pull stopped. Kathy stopped moving, her body frozen in place once again. She could feel the presence of the figure behind her, its breath hot and foul against her neck, but she couldn't turn to face it. She couldn't move at all. The figure's voice rumbled in her mind like a distant thunderclap. "You will stay with me," it said. "You will stay forever." Kathy's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the weight of its words crushing down on her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but the darkness that enveloped her mind made it impossible to think clearly. She could feel herself slipping slowly, helplessly into its grip. Then, without warning, the house seemed to shake. The walls trembled, the floor beneath them groaned, and the very air seemed to shift. For a split second, Kathy thought she saw something, a crack in the walls, a faint light cutting through the darkness. But it was gone before she could register it. The figure moved closer. "You cannot leave it," repeated its voice, more insistent now. "You will stay here. Forever." Kathy's eyes flickered to George, still standing beside her. He was staring at her now, his eyes full of confusion and fear. He reached for her, his hand trembling. But even as he touched her, something changed in his eyes. It was as if he recognized what was happening, as if he understood the truth of it all. "We can't fight it," George whispered, his voice a hollow echo. "We're already gone." Kathy wanted to argue, to scream at him, but the words wouldn't come. She felt her strength fading, her will to fight slipping away. The house had taken everything from them, their sanity, their hope, their will to live. And then, for the first time, Kathy understood. The house didn't just want them to stay. It wanted them to become part of it, to be swallowed whole, to be consumed by its darkness. It wasn't satisfied with just their fear. It wanted their souls. The figure's hands reached out, long and skeletal, grasping at Kathy's chest. She felt a cold, suffocating grip wrap around her heart, crushing it with a pressure she couldn't explain. The house was feeding on her fear, on her terror. It was feeding on them both. Kathy could feel herself slipping into the abyss, her body growing cold, her thoughts growing distant. But just before she lost consciousness, she thought she heard something. A voice, distant but familiar, calling out to her. "Don't give in." The words echoed through her mind, but they were fading, growing quieter by the second. She struggled to hold onto them, to grasp onto the last thread of hope, but it was no use. The house had won. Kathy's world had become a blur of dark shadows and cold, suffocating silence. Her body felt as though it were suspended in a void, her senses dulled and disconnected from reality. The weight of the figure's presence seemed to fill the space around her, pressing in on her from all sides, and the suffocating grasp of the house tightened around her chest. But then, just as all seemed lost, there was a flicker of awareness. It wasn't much, just a faint sensation, a brief moment where the darkness lifted, and Kathy could feel the faintest stirrings of her own thoughts. She was still there, still trapped in the house. But for the briefest moment, she felt something else. A pulse of energy, distant but undeniable. Like a thread of light trying to pierce through the suffocating blackness. She reached for it, struggling, clawing through the darkness with every ounce of strength she had left. Her hands trembled as she fought to reach the thread of light, to hold on to it as her last hope. She didn't know where it came from or what it was, but it felt like freedom. It felt like someone was reaching out to her. George's voice, faint and distant, echoed in her mind. "Kathy, fight back." It was enough to rouse her from the numbing haze. George, his voice still tethered to her somehow. But how was he still with her? Had he too felt the strange pull, the stirring of resistance that had momentarily shaken the house's grip on them? Her eyes fluttered open, and the darkness that had once consumed her began to shift slowly, but surely. The oppressive weight of the house's presence still lingered, but it was no longer the all-encompassing force it had been. The suffocating cold began to recede, and the shadows that had stretched endlessly before them began to shrink, retreating into the corners of the room like frightened creatures. Kathy gasped for air, her breath sharp and ragged, as if she had just risen from underwater. The darkness still surrounded her, but it no longer held her in its grip. She could move again. Her limbs were free, her thoughts no longer clouded by the fear that had gripped her so tightly. "Kathy." George's voice was softer now, closer. She turned toward it, her vision still blurred, but the sound of his voice, the warmth of his presence grounded her. He was there beside her, no longer lost in the dark grasp of the house. She reached out to him, her fingers trembling as she touched his arm. His skin was warm, his body solid, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Kathy realized they hadn't been completely consumed by the house, not yet. "We're not gone," Kathy whispered, the realization dawning on her. "We're still here, George. We can still fight." George's gaze met hers, his eyes wide with disbelief. How? But Kathy couldn't answer. The answer wasn't something they could grasp with words. It was something they had to feel, something they had to fight for. The house had taken so much from them, but it couldn't take everything. It couldn't take their will to survive, not if they fought back. The darkness still pulsed around them, but now it felt more like a distant hum, still present, but no longer as oppressive. The figure, once so solid and imposing, began to flicker in and out of existence, as though it were struggling to maintain its form, its power over them. It was weakening. "It's not over," Kathy said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We can still get out." George nodded slowly, his face still pale, but no longer filled with the same terror. "Then let's finish this." They stood together side by side, facing the now wavering presence of the figure. The whispers had quieted, replaced by the sound of their own breathing, each breath heavy, but filled with purpose. They had been through so much already, but they had not yet given in. And as long as they still had the strength to fight, they weren't going to let the house win. The figure's form flickered again, more violently this time, as if the house itself was tearing at the seams. Its red eyes glowed with fury, but there was something else now, a hint of fear, a crack in its malevolent power. "You cannot leave," the figure hissed, its voice distorted, almost panicked. "You belong to me, forever." But Kathy wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the house's darkness head-on, and now with George by her side, she could feel the strength that had been buried deep within her rising to the surface. "No," Kathy said, her voice steady, powerful. "We don't belong to you, not anymore." The figure screeched its form, distorting further, its red eyes now dimming as though the very essence of its power was being stripped away. The house, too, seemed to recoil the oppressive energy that had filled it now, fraying, unraveling at the edges. It was as if the house itself was fighting to hold on to them, but Kathy and George were no longer its prisoners. With a final deafening roar, the figure exploded into darkness, dissolving into nothingness, and the house seemed to tremble with the force of its departure. The coldness lifted, the air cleared, and the oppressive weight that had settled on their chests slowly began to dissipate. For a moment, there was only silence. And then the faintest whisper, as if the house itself had been silenced. "We're free," George breathed, his voice trembling but full of relief. Kathy nodded, tears streaming down her face. She was exhausted, drained, but she could feel it now. The house no longer held them. They had broken free, but as they turned to leave, they both paused. The door was open. For the first time since they'd arrived, the path outside the house was clear. The darkness had been lifted, and they were free to leave. They walked toward the door hand in hand, the house behind them, now just a hollow, empty shell. And when they stepped outside into the light of the setting sun, they knew they had escaped. The house had lost, but as they walked away, Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, waiting in the shadows, lurking just beyond their sight. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a single breath of relief. They had survived, and for now, that was enough. The sunlight felt surreal against Kathy's skin, warm and comforting, like the world was finally allowing them to breathe again. After days, no weeks of suffocating dread of darkness and terror that had seemed unending, the world outside the house felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The birds sang, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and everything was so ordinary, so mundane, that it almost felt like they had woken up from some horrifying dream. But deep down, Kathy knew better. They hadn't been dreaming. They had survived. George's hand was still firmly wrapped around hers, his grip strong but gentle. He glanced over at her, his eyes tired but filled with a quiet kind of relief. "Kathy, we did it. We're free." She nodded, but the weight of their experience still hung heavy in her chest. It wasn't just the terror of the house. It was the knowledge that despite everything they had gone through, something far more sinister had taken root within them. The house had been more than just a place. It had been a force, a living thing, and it had tried to break them. Kathy could still feel the echoes of its presence, like a shadow that lingered just out of sight, always waiting to strike again. The driveway stretched out in front of them, the path leading away from the house, away from the nightmare they had left behind. But as they reached the gate, Kathy couldn't help but turn around her eyes, scanning the dark silhouette of the house against the backdrop of the fading sun. The walls still stood tall and imposing, but now there was no movement, no life within. The windows were empty, lifeless, just the remnants of the horrors that had once consumed them. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. "We should leave," she said quietly, her voice thick with uncertainty. "We can't stay here. We've been so close to it, George. I feel like it's still watching us." George didn't answer immediately, but he too was staring back at the house as though his eyes were drawn to it, unwilling to let go of the thing they had fought so hard to escape. He squeezed Kathy's hand, as if grounding her in the moment. "We're not going back," he said firmly. "We're leaving. We're done." But as they turned to leave, Kathy couldn't help but notice the way the air around them had shifted. The trees, once alive with the wind's whispers, now seemed eerily still. The quiet was too much, too unnatural. It felt like something was missing, like they were being watched even now from the distance. Kathy's stomach turned, the unease rising within her again. Was it just her imagination, Or was there something about the house, the land beneath their feet, that wouldn't let them go? She could still hear it deep in her mind, the faint whispers, the echo of the voices that had once filled the house. "George," she began, her voice trembling. "Do you think it's really over?" George's expression shifted, the lines of worry creeping back into his face. "What are you saying?" Kathy hesitated, struggling to put into words the fear that gnawed at her. "I don't know. It's just, I feel like it's still there. Like it's waiting for us. The house. It was too strong. It had a power that..." But George shook his head, his voice firm. "Kathy, we're free. That's all that matters. The house is empty. It's gone. We have our lives back." But even as he spoke, Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't left the house behind at all. The terror, the darkness, the weight, it was still with her. She could feel it now in the very air around them. The land they had stepped onto felt tainted somehow, like it had been corrupted by the house's evil. It wasn't over, not yet, and then she saw it, a figure standing in the distance far down the road just beyond the bend. At first, it looked like a shadow, like a trick of the fading light. But as Kathy squinted, she saw it clearly, a figure tall and dark, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. They were far from the house now, miles away, but the figure stood there, unblinking its eyes, glowing faintly red in the fading light. "George!" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Look!" George followed her gaze, his eyes widening as he saw the figure too. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he whispered. "It's not possible. We left. It's gone. We're free." But Kathy couldn't look away. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching them with those burning red eyes, its form solidifying in the twilight. Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, and Kathy felt the weight of the figure's gaze bearing down on her. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a memory. It was something real, something following them. George turned to her, panic rising in his voice. "We need to go. Now." But Kathy didn't move. She couldn't. The house's grip, its darkness had followed them, whether it was in the figure in the land itself, or in some twisted piece of reality they couldn't escape. She didn't know. But she knew one thing for sure: it wasn't over. Not yet. The figure stepped forward, its outline sharper now against the backdrop of the dying sun. It moved toward them, slow and deliberate, its form flickering in the growing shadows. Kathy's legs were like stone, her body frozen in place. She could feel the darkness pushing in around them once more. It was not the house that had been the prison. It was something deeper, something that had followed them, something that had never let them go. And as the figure drew closer, Kathy realized the truth. The house hadn't been the source of their terror. It had only been a beginning. Kathy's heart pounded in her chest, each beat reverberating through her like a drum, but her feet remained frozen to the ground. The figure loomed ahead, the red glow of its eyes growing brighter, intensifying with every step it took. The air around them had become thick, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. George reached for her, his hands trembling. "Kathy, we need to move. We can't stay here." His voice was desperate, almost frantic, but Kathy couldn't look away from the figure. It was as if everything inside her screamed that she was not allowed to look away, that the moment she did, the darkness would overtake them completely. The figure moved closer, its form becoming clearer with each passing second, its features dark and twisted, almost alien. It was taller now, no longer just a shadow in the distance, but a looming, solid presence. Kathy could see the outline of a twisted, grotesque face, its features malformed, its eyes wide and glowing, filled with an insatiable hunger. And the longer she stared at it, the more she felt the pull like a magnet drawing her closer. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. It can't be." But even as she said the words, she felt the weight of the figure's gaze sink deeper into her mind. It wasn't just a figure. It wasn't just a shadow from the house. It was something much older, much more powerful. Something that had never left. Something that had followed them relentlessly, waiting for the moment they would believe they were free. Kathy could feel the air crackle with energy, an unseen force thickening around them, like the calm before the storm. She could hear the whispers again, this time louder, clearer. They came from everywhere, from the ground beneath her, from the trees, from the very air itself. "You cannot escape," the voices murmured. "You are mine. You will never leave." The figure moved closer still, its form shifting, growing larger, as if consuming the space between them. Kathy's heart raced. The dread that had once been confined to the house was now alive in the world outside, in the very ground they stood on. George stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. "This isn't possible. We left. We got out." But Kathy's voice was barely a whisper. "It's not over, George. We're still trapped. It's not just the house." Her words seemed to echo in the silent air, but they felt hollow, as if they were swallowed by the vast, unyielding force that surrounded them. She could feel it now, pulsing beneath her feet. The land, the earth beneath them, had been marked by the house, and that mark would never fade. The figure's voice rumbled, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. "You will never escape it," growled. "You belong to me." Kathy's vision blurred as the figure grew closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. All she could hear was the rushing of blood in her ears, the whispers that filled her mind, drowning out everything else. Suddenly, there was a flash of light, a bright, blinding light that seemed to cut through the oppressive darkness. Kathy squeezed her eyes shut, the intensity of the light searing into her skin. But when she opened them again, the figure was gone. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers stopped. The coldness receded. The air felt lighter. Kathy's breath came in sharp gasps, but it wasn't from the weight of fear. It was from relief. The figure was gone. She turned to George, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What happened? Where did it go?" George didn't respond immediately. He was staring at the ground, his expression one of confusion and fear. Finally, he shook his head, as though trying to clear away the fog that had settled over his mind. "I don't know," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "But it's gone. It's not here anymore." But Kathy knew better. Something had shifted. The force that had controlled them, that had driven them to the edge of madness, hadn't been vanquished. It was still there, waiting, watching. She glanced back at the house one last time. The shadow of the place still loomed in the distance, even though they were far away. It wasn't the house that haunted them anymore. It was something far deeper, far more ancient than they could ever comprehend. The house had only been a conduit, a vessel for something much darker, much more powerful, and it wasn't done with them yet. "We're not free," Kathy whispered, her voice barely audible. "We thought we were, but we're still in its grip. It's never going to let us go." George turned to her, his eyes filled with doubt. "No, we got out. We left. But Kathy cut him off, her voice trembling with the weight of what she knew. "No, George. You don't understand. It's not just the house. It's something that follows you. It attaches itself, feeds off you. It won't stop." A chill ran through her, a cold shiver that swept down her spine. The figure might have vanished, but the evil that had taken root in their lives was far from finished. It had claimed them once. It could claim them again. Kathy took a deep breath, her mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. They had left the house. They had escaped its walls, its horrors. But they had never left the evil behind. It had followed them, seeping into their very souls, waiting for the moment to strike. And as Kathy looked back at the house, she realized one terrible truth: escaping wasn't enough. They would have to destroy it, completely, utterly. But how? How could they destroy something that seemed to live, to breathe, to exist outside the confines of their understanding? The figure might be gone for now, but the house was still alive, and it would keep coming, keep haunting them until they faced it once again. The weight of Kathy's words hung in the air, suffocating the space between them. George stood still for a long moment, staring at her, as though trying to process what she had just said. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, as if the world had stopped turning. But Kathy could feel it, the sense that the house was still there, just beyond the edge of their perception, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. She turned away from him, her eyes scanning the landscape around them. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the sky a soft shade of lavender, as the last of the sunlight faded into dusk. It was beautiful, peaceful even. But beneath that calm exterior, something darker simmered. It was as though the world around them was holding its breath, waiting for the next horrific chapter to unfold. "We have to destroy it," Kathy repeated, her voice steady, but filled with a deep, gnawing urgency. "There's no other way. As long as it's still here somewhere, it will never let us go." George shook his head as though trying to shake off the dread that had crept into his own thoughts. "We can't. We've been through too much. We've survived it. The house is gone. The figure's gone. We made it out." But even as he spoke, Kathy could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't truly believe it. Not really. Not deep down. "George," she said quietly, "you saw it. The figure. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something else. It was part of the house, yes, but it was more than that. It was something ancient. Something that doesn't just haunt places. It haunts people." George didn't answer. His lips pressed together in a tight line, and for the first time, Kathy saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He was afraid, not just of the house, but of the unknown, of the thing that had been following them, the thing that had never let them go. "You're right," he finally said, his voice soft, resigned. "I can feel it too. It's not over. But how? How do we destroy something like this?" Kathy closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cold evening air wash over her. She could feel the answer deep inside, but it was hard to grasp. The house, the figure, the darkness that had stalked them, it wasn't just about physical destruction. It wasn't just a matter of breaking down walls or burning the house to the ground. This was something far older, something that existed outside of the natural world. And yet she knew that the key was tied to the land, to the house, to whatever dark force had taken root there. "We need to go back," Kathy said, her voice steady now, the weight of her decision settling in her bones. "We need to go back to the house, to its foundation." George stared at her, his expression one of disbelief. "Back there? After everything, you want to go back to that place?" She nodded. "It's the only way. The house isn't just a building, George. It's a vessel. It's anchored to the land itself. We need to destroy the land, the foundation, the source of its power." The words felt heavy in the air, like they were too much to bear, but Kathy didn't back down. She knew what needed to be done. They had been through hell to escape that house, but escaping wasn't enough. They couldn't outrun it. Not forever. George didn't speak immediately. his eyes searching her face as if looking for some sign that this was all a terrible mistake. But Kathy didn't waver. She had already made up her mind. "We don't have a choice," she whispered. "We have to stop it now before it claims anyone else." The land beneath them seemed to pulse the ground, vibrating ever so slightly, as if it were alive, as if it were listening. The house, though far in the distance, loomed over them, its presence still haunting the air, as though it was waiting for them to come back to face it once more. George exhaled a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't run anymore. We have to finish this." Kathy nodded, turning her gaze toward the dark horizon. The road ahead was long, and the journey back to the house would be fraught with terror, but she could feel it now deep in her gut. The house wasn't just a place. It was a force, a malevolent power that would continue to hunt them down over and over again until they took away its power. Together they turned toward the path leading back to the house. It was as if the land itself was drawing them in, pushing them toward their final confrontation. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of what was to come pressed down on them with each step. The house seemed smaller now, almost insignificant in the distance, but Kathy knew better. It was still alive, still watching, waiting for them to return, to finish what they had started. The darkness that had once consumed them was still there just beneath the surface, ready to strike again. But this time they wouldn't run. They wouldn't hide. They would face it. Together. And as they walked side by side toward the house that had nearly destroyed them, Kathy felt the first stirrings of hope. It was a quiet, fragile thing, but it was there. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed they might actually survive this. The ground beneath their feet felt different now, as if the very earth had become soaked with the darkness that had once filled the house. The air was colder, the silence deeper, and every step they took seemed to echo with the weight of their past decisions. The house loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the deepening twilight. The once charming exterior now appeared cold, lifeless, its windows like dark eyes staring out at them. Kathy's heart pounded as they drew closer. The whispers that had once filled the house still lingered in her mind, haunting her every thought. She could feel them swirling around her just out of reach, but still present, like a storm waiting to break. The fear that had settled deep within her chest all those weeks ago began to stir again, the anxiety creeping up her spine. George seemed to feel it too. His hand tightened around hers, a silent reassurance. But there was no mistaking the fear in his eyes. He hadn't fully believed that the house would haunt them again. Not like this. But the closer they got, the more he began to see the truth. "This is insane," he muttered under his breath. "We shouldn't be doing this. This place, it's not just a house. It's—" "I know," Kathy interrupted, her voice steady, though her insides were a tangled mess of fear and resolve. "But we don't have a choice. We have to stop it. If we don't, it'll keep coming for us." They stood there for a moment, staring at the house as if trying to come to terms with what they had to do. The world seemed still suspended in that moment, and Kathy felt as though the very air was holding its breath. It was as if the house was waiting for them to step inside to give in to its call, but they didn't hesitate. Together, they walked toward the front door, which was ajar, creaking on its hinges, as if welcoming them back. The sight of it made Kathy's stomach tighten, the fear flooding back in waves, but she didn't allow herself to stop. This wasn't about fear. This wasn't about running. It was about taking control, about fighting back against the thing that had tried to destroy them. Inside the house was just as they remembered it, cold, oppressive, and filled with the thick, suffocating air of evil. The walls seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, their once white paint now yellowed and peeling, as if the house had been slowly decaying from the inside out. The floorboards creaked under their feet, and every step they took seemed to draw the darkness closer. The whispering started again, low and distant at first, like a murmur on the wind. Kathy clenched her fists, trying to push the noise out of her head, but it was impossible. The voices were everywhere now, swirling around them, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. "You should have never come back," the voices whispered. "You belong to me. You cannot escape." Kathy's chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The house wasn't just alive, it was aware, sentient in a way that made her skin crawl. It was feeding on their fear, on their doubt, on the terror they had experienced within its walls. George was right beside her, his breath ragged, but he didn't let go of her hand. They were in this together, and they weren't going to give up. They couldn't. "We need to get to the basement," Kathy said, her voice shaky but determined. "That's where it all started. That's where the house's power is anchored." George nodded, his eyes scanning the darkened hallway. "All right, but we need to be quick. If we wait too long, I don't know what's going to happen." Together, they moved through the house, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The walls seemed to close in around them, the darkness growing thicker with each passing second. Kathy could feel the house's presence pressing in from all sides, but she kept moving forward. The basement door was just ahead. They were so close. As they reached the door, it swung open by itself, creaking on its hinges like a warning. A chill swept over them as they stepped into the basement, the cold air hitting their skin like a slap. The basement was just as they remembered it, dark, damp, and filled with an oppressive energy that seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. In the center of the room stood the source of the house's power, the furnace. It had once been the heart of the home, but now it was something more. The shadows in the room seemed to twist and pulse around it, drawn to its dark presence. The furnace, though silent, seemed to hum with a malevolent energy, as if it had been waiting for them to return. "This is it," Kathy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to destroy it." George nodded, his face grim. "We need to destroy whatever's feeding it. We have to break the cycle." They approached the furnace, slowly, cautiously. Kathy could feel the heat emanating from it, even though it wasn't lit. The furnace seemed to draw them closer, its influence growing stronger with each step they took. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was pleading with them to stop, to leave, to turn back. But they didn't stop. Together, they reached the furnace. Kathy placed her hand on the cold metal, and for a moment she felt it, an overwhelming rush of power, a surge of darkness that threatened to engulf her completely. She gasped, pulling her hand back, but the presence of the house was still there, still looming. "We need to break the seal," Kathy said, her voice trembling. "We need to destroy the furnace, the foundation of its power. It's the only way." George didn't hesitate. He grabbed a nearby tool, a crowbar left from when they had tried to fix the house before. He raised it high and slammed it into the furnace with all his strength. The metal groaned, and for a moment, nothing happened. But then slowly, a crack appeared along the side of the furnace, a faint glow seeping from within. The glow intensified, becoming blindingly bright, and the house seemed to shake with a terrible force. The air around them grew thick and heavy, as if the house was fighting back, trying to prevent them from destroying its heart. But Kathy wasn't afraid anymore. She could feel the strength within her, the strength they had gained from surviving the house, from facing its horrors and refusing to give in. With a final, forceful swing, George struck the furnace again. The crack widened, and suddenly the furnace exploded with a burst of light so bright that it nearly blinded them. The house trembled, its walls groaning, as the dark energy that had once filled it began to dissipate. The whispers stopped. The oppressive weight of fear lifted, and for the first time, the house felt still empty. They stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, the remnants of the furnace's destruction still swirling around them. But the house was silent now. The darkness that had once claimed them was gone, and for the first time, Kathy and George felt free. "We did it," George said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "We're free." Kathy nodded, a small, exhausted smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Yes, we're free." But as they turned to leave, Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't completely defeated the evil that had taken hold of them. She felt it deep inside, a lingering presence, a shadow that would forever be a part of them. And as they walked out of the house, leaving it behind for good, she whispered one final thought to herself. Some things never truly die. The night air was cold, but the chill that had once haunted Kathy's bones was now absent. The house, now a smoldering shell behind them, seemed to shrink in their minds, becoming smaller and smaller with every step they took away from it. Yet despite the sense of release, Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following them, lurking in the shadows. The house may have been broken, its heart destroyed, but its echoes seemed to linger. George kept walking beside her, his steps slow, deliberate, but his gaze often flickering toward the house behind them. He wasn't looking at it with fear. No, that was gone. But there was a trace of something else in his eyes, something that mirrored Kathy's own unease. The battle was over, but the war that wasn't finished. Not yet. They reached the old road that led them out of the neighborhood, the one that had once brought them to the house with the false promise of peace. The street lamps overhead cast long shadows, their dim light illuminating the empty road. The houses they passed were silent, abandoned, as if the entire world had stopped moving, holding its breath. Kathy couldn't help but glance over at George, searching his face for answers. She wasn't sure how to ask. "Do you think it's truly over?" George's lips parted, as though he was going to answer, but the words died on his tongue. He stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "I wish I could say yes. I wish I could say we're done with it. But the house, that place, it was just the beginning." Kathy's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" George looked away, his eyes fixed on the horizon, the fading light of the house growing smaller in the distance. It wasn't the house itself that was evil. It was something deeper, something older than we can understand. The house was just a vessel for it. And as long as it's still out there, it's never really gone. The words hung heavy between them, and Kathy felt the weight of them settle into her chest. They had destroyed the house, the source of their torment, but in doing so, they had only scratched the surface of something much darker. The house had been a beacon, a stronghold for something that had been lying in wait, biding its time. They had freed themselves from its grip, but they hadn't rid themselves of the evil that had fed on them. "I'm scared." Kathy whispered the admission falling from her lips before she could stop it. "What if we can never escape it? What if it's always going to follow us?" George turned back toward her, his face softening with the weight of her words. He reached out, taking her hand in his once more. "We're alive, Kathy, and we're stronger than we were before. We've been through hell and survived. Whatever it is that's following us, whatever darkness still lingers, it can't take us down. Not if we keep fighting." The words, though comforting, didn't completely erase the gnawing feeling that clung to Kathy's heart. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that they were free. But the lingering sensation, the unease that followed them like a shadow, was too strong. It was as if the land itself had been marked by the house, and now that mark would stay with them forever. They continued walking, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. The world around them felt too still, too quiet. The night stretched out in front of them like an endless void, and Kathy couldn't help but feel like they were walking towards something unknown, something worse than the house. "I don't want to go back there," she said softly, almost to herself. "I don't want to face it again." George squeezed her hand. "You won't have to. We'll face whatever comes together. We'll fight it just like we always have." But Kathy wasn't so sure. The evil had taken many forms, first in the house, then in the figure, and now in the very air around them. There was no escaping it, and no matter how far they ran, no matter how hard they fought, it felt like it would always be just behind them, watching from the shadows. As they walked further into the night, a low, distant sound broke the silence. At first, Kathy thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but as she listened more closely, the sound began to shape itself into something more distinct, a whisper. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the wind. The whispers, familiar and haunting, began to grow louder, closer. They surrounded them, filling the air with their chilling, indecipherable murmur. Kathy's blood ran cold as she felt a presence behind them, a coldness that pressed in from every direction. George stopped dead in his tracks, his hand slipping from hers. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Kathy nodded, her heart pounding. "It's back. It's following us." The whispers grew louder, but now there was a new sound too, a low growling hum, like the earth itself was alive, its voice rising in unholy unison with the whispering. Kathy turned quickly, scanning the empty road behind them. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, but there was nothing there, nothing except the thick darkness that seemed to be reaching for them, as if it were waiting for them to turn around to face it. "We need to run," George said, urgently, grabbing her hand again. But Kathy couldn't move. She couldn't shake the feeling that running wouldn't matter. The evil that had once been confined to the house was now everywhere. It had seeped into the very land itself. "It's never over," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling with the truth of it. "No matter where we go, no matter what we do, it will follow." George's grip tightened on her hand. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. They weren't free. They never had been. And the evil that had haunted them, that had tried to consume them, would always find a way back. It wasn't just a house they had to fight. It was something much older, something that would never let them go. And as the whispers grew louder, closer, Kathy realized the true horror of it all. Some things aren't just houses. They're curses. And no matter how far you run, they'll always find you in the end. The night had become a labyrinth of whispers and shadows, each step forward swallowed by the eerie, constant murmur that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath their feet. Kathy could feel the coldness pressing down on her, as if the land itself had become a living thing, alive with malice, with an unyielding hunger. The trees around them, once familiar, now looked like twisted sentinels, their branches like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky, blocking out the moonlight, leaving them in suffocating darkness. George's hand tightened around hers, but even his grip seemed fragile in the face of the overwhelming presence that loomed over them. He wasn't just holding her to reassure her. He was holding on to himself, fighting the same dread that had begun to overtake them both. The house had been a beginning, a catalyst, but the true nightmare, it seemed, had followed them. "We can't run from this," Kathy whispered, her voice filled with a cold resignation. "It's not just a house. It's something much worse." George nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. "But we can't stop moving forward. We have to keep going." Kathy didn't know if she believed him. Could they truly escape it? Could they outrun something so ancient, so deeply embedded in the land, that even the very air seemed to pulse with its presence? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't coming from just the wind or the trees. They were inside her head now, a constant barrage of voices, each one different, but all united by a single horrifying command. "Come back, come back." She turned to George, her face etched with terror. "It wants us to go back, George. To return." His face paled further. "Back to the house, no. We can't. We already destroyed it." But Kathy could see the truth in his eyes. The house wasn't gone. Not really. It had been a manifestation of something much deeper, something that wasn't tied to physical walls or boundaries. The evil had spread like a cancer, reaching beyond the confines of the house and into the very fabric of the world around them. They had been naive to think that destroying the house would end it. They had only broken one vessel, one shell, but the evil within it had not been contained. It was ancient, primordial, and as old as the land itself. George, Kathy whispered, her voice filled with dread. "It's not over. It's never going to end, is it?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes said everything she needed to know. He knew it too. They had never truly escaped. The evil they had fought, the horror they had endured, was a part of them now. It had marked them, and no matter how far they ran, it would always be there, lingering in the darkness, in the shadows of their minds. The whispers seemed to swell in volume, as though the land itself was alive, breathing around them, pulling them back toward the house that had once been their prison. They could feel the pull, the magnetic force drawing them closer, urging them to return to the very place they had tried to leave behind. Kathy's legs trembled, but she forced herself to take a step forward, to keep moving, to fight against the pull. She had to keep moving. She had to survive. They had come this far, they couldn't turn back now. But the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, to change. The road ahead grew darker, as though the very path had been consumed by the shadow that had followed them. The trees loomed larger now, their branches stretching out like claws, trapping them in a tunnel of darkness. "George, look!" Kathy cried, her voice filled with terror as she pointed ahead. George followed her gaze, and his face fell. The house was back. Not in the distance, not looming behind them, but right in front of them. As though it had never left, it stood there solid and imposing, exactly as it had when they had first arrived, its dark windows staring down at them, like eyes, its doors wide open, waiting for them to enter. "No," George whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. We're not here. We can't be here. It's not possible." But it was. It was real. The house had drawn them back, just as it had done with so many others before them. Kathy felt the coldness deep in her bones. They had come full circle. The house, the evil, the darkness, they hadn't destroyed it. They had only fed it, given it more power. And now it was here, standing before them, demanding that they return. The whispers rose again, louder now, almost deafening. Come back to me." Kathy felt her resolve crumbling. She wanted to run, to flee, to escape, but her body refused to move. It was as if the house had planted roots inside her mind, in her very soul. She could feel its presence growing, suffocating her, draining her will to fight. "We can't fight it," George said, his voice trembling with the same terror that filled her own heart. "It's too powerful." "No," Kathy whispered fiercely, her hands trembling. "We won't give in. We won't go back." But the house was already pulling them in. The ground beneath their feet was shifting, the very earth seeming to twist to drag them back toward the house. The door swung open on its own, beckoning them inside, inviting them to return to the nightmare they had tried to escape. Kathy closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. She couldn't let the house win. Not this time. Not ever again. When she opened her eyes, she found herself standing in front of the house, her feet rooted to the ground. The door was open, and the whispers had stopped, but something else had begun. The figure, the shadow that had followed them from the very beginning, stood in the doorway, waiting for them. Its glowing red eyes burned brighter now, its form more solid, more real. "You came back," it whispered, its voice low, filled with malevolent satisfaction. "And now, you will stay." Kathy felt her breath catch in her throat. She had tried to run to escape, but now she realized that the house had always been waiting for them. It had never let them go. And now they were part of it, trapped in its endless, ever-hungry darkness. George took her hand again, his grip tight, but filled with the same unspoken determination. "We won't give up. Not now." Together they faced the figure, the door to the house wide open behind them, waiting for them to enter, to succumb. But they didn't move. The battle was not over. Not yet. The figure in the doorway stood still, watching them with its glowing red eyes, its form flickering between solid and shadow. Kathy's heart raced as she tightened her grip on George's hand. Every inch of her body screamed for her to run to escape, but she couldn't bring herself to move. The figure, whatever it was, had been with them all along, and now it was closer than ever. It wasn't just a manifestation of the house anymore. It had become something much more dangerous, something far more personal. The whispers had returned softer now, but no less insistent. They circled around her, worming their way into her thoughts, urging her to step forward to enter the house once more. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered. Its voice was like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, hollow and cold. "You belong here. You always have." Kathy's knees felt weak. The air around her was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The figure's presence seemed to grow, its form expanding, darkening the space around them. George stepped forward, his voice steady, but filled with the same fear Kathy felt. "No," he said firmly. "We're not going back. We won't let you win." The figure's red eyes flickered as if considering his words. Then it spoke again, its voice darker, deeper, reverberating through the air like a distant thunderclap. "You have no choice," it hissed. "You are mine. You always have been. There is nowhere you can run, nowhere you can hide. This is your home now." Kathy's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a physical blow. The house, this place, this force, had never really been about walls or windows or rooms. It had been about them. It had always been about them. George stepped in front of her, blocking her view of the figure, his face resolute, though she could see the fear in his eyes. "We're not your prisoners," he said, his voice trembling but determined. "We won't let you take us." The figure seemed to laugh, the sound low and hollow, echoing through the very ground beneath them. It stepped forward, its form becoming clearer, more tangible, as though it were emerging from the shadows themselves. "You cannot resist it," said its voice now, a terrifying blend of every whisper they had ever heard in the house. "I am everything you fear. I am the darkness that lives inside you, the terror that will never leave." Kathy's chest tightened, the words sinking deep into her soul. She could feel the truth of it, the way the darkness had seeped into them, into their very minds, ever since they had first set foot in that cursed place. It had never been about the house. It had been about what they carried with them, what they had allowed the house to plant inside them. The fear, the uncertainty, the darkness that had taken root. She closed her eyes, trying to shut it all out. But the figure's words kept coming, pushing into her mind, filling her thoughts. She could see the house in her mind's eye, its windows dark, like empty eyes, its walls closing in around her. She could feel the weight of the evil that had once consumed them, the suffocating presence that had taken everything from them. "No," she whispered, barely hearing her own voice over the whispers that had once filled the house. "We won't let you in." Not again. And then something inside her shifted. It wasn't a grand moment of revelation, but a quiet, internal knowing. She understood finally that the house's power had never been in the walls, the figures, the shadows. It was in their fear, their doubt. In every moment, they had allowed it to control them. Kathy took a deep breath, her hands shaking, but her resolve solidifying. She could feel the house's pull, the whispers still curling around her mind, but they didn't have to win. Not anymore. She had fought too hard to give in now. George turned to her, his face filled with a mix of fear and hope. She could see it in his eyes. He was willing to face it, to fight, if only they could find a way. "We fight back," she said, her voice stronger now, the words rising with conviction. "We face it. We face the darkness, and we don't let it win." Together, they stepped toward the house, their eyes never leaving the figure in the doorway. The air felt heavier as they moved forward, but this time, Kathy felt something different. It was as though with every step, the grip of the darkness loosened just a little more. They weren't running from it. They weren't afraid anymore. The figure in the doorway growled a low, guttural sound, but Kathy and George didn't stop. They kept moving, drawing closer to the house toward the source of the evil that had once nearly destroyed them. And then, with one final step, they crossed the threshold. The moment they did, the air changed. The weight lifted. The whispers fell silent. The figure in the doorway froze, its glowing red eyes narrowing with fury. It reached out, its shadowy form flickering, but it couldn't touch them. They were no longer afraid. "You have no power here." Kathy said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on the figure. "We're done running. We're done being afraid." The figure let out a shrill scream, its form distorting violently, its shadowy limbs stretching and thrashing in all directions. But it wasn't enough. It was weakening. The house's power, its hold on them, was slipping away. Together, George and Kathy stood tall, their hearts steady, as they faced the dark entity that had haunted them. This time, they weren't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for their freedom, for their peace. The figure faltered its form, collapsing into nothingness, its red eyes dimming. The house trembled one final time, as if releasing the last of its hold on them. And then it was silent. Kathy and George stood there in the empty doorway, breathing heavily but free. They had done it. They had faced the darkness, and they had won. The house, the evil that had once consumed them, had been destroyed. The whispers had faded. The figure was gone. And for the first time, they were free. They turned and walked away from the house, hand in hand, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, empty night. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in their lives, they felt hope, a quiet, steady hope that they could finally move on. And as they walked into the night, away from the place that had once held them captive, Kathy couldn't help but smile. The darkness was behind them, and the light, however faint, was ahead. The night air felt different now, lighter, freer, as if the world had exhaled alongside them. The oppressive weight that had followed them for so long had lifted, and for the first time, Kathy allowed herself to feel the full weight of the silence that surrounded them. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of the fear, the whispers, the darkness that had followed them for what felt like an eternity. As they walked, Kathy couldn't help but glance at the road ahead. The house, the nightmare, was behind them now, its shadow receding with every step they took. The path was empty, stretching out before them like a clean slate. The future was unknown, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Kathy felt a sense of possibility. They had fought the darkness, and they had won. George kept pace beside her, his hand still tightly holding hers. though his grip had softened. He was still there by her side, just as he had been when everything had begun. She hadn't realized how much she had needed him until this moment, until the house had finally lost its grip on them. He glanced at her, his face reflecting the same quiet relief that filled her chest. "Do you think we'll ever be able to forget?" he asked softly, his voice unsure. "I mean everything we've been through. The house, the darkness, the whispers. Can we ever really move on?" Kathy didn't answer immediately. The question hung in the air between them, the weight of it settling in her bones. Could they ever truly forget? Could they erase what had happened, what they had lived through, what had haunted them for so long? She took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill her lungs. "I don't think we'll ever forget," she said, her voice steady. "But I think we can heal. We can learn to live with it, to move forward despite it." George nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I hope you're right. I really do. I just don't know how to let go of all the fear, all the pain. It feels like it's still with me, lurking in the back of my mind." Kathy squeezed his hand, offering him the silent support that she knew he needed. "It will take time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Healing isn't something that happens overnight, but we've already made it through the worst of it, together, and that's what matters." They walked in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the night filling the space around them. The chirping of distant crickets, the rustling of the trees, the faint breeze that carried the scent of earth and pine. It was peaceful, almost surreal. Kathy looked up at the sky, her gaze drifting to the stars that twinkled overhead. She could feel the weight of the past slipping away, not completely, but enough to give her hope. For the first time in so long, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, wondering when the darkness would return. She was looking ahead to the future. "We're not going back," George said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "I mean it, Kathy. We're not going to let it consume us anymore. We've survived it, and we're not going to let it take us down." Kathy nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. She believed him. For the first time, she believed that they had won, that they had truly defeated the darkness. "I know," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "We're stronger now, and we'll keep moving forward, together." They continued walking side by side, their footsteps growing quieter as the world around them seemed to exhale in relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs to travel. And no matter what happened, no matter what they encountered, they would face it together. Kathy's thoughts drifted back to the house, to the figure, to the endless whispers that had once haunted them. But now, those thoughts didn't fill her with terror. They didn't control her anymore. They were part of the past, a past she had survived. And as long as she and George had each other, the darkness would never take them again. The night stretched out before them, vast and endless, full of possibility. And as they walked away from the house, from the nightmare, Kathy realized something important. While the house had been a place of horror, it had also been a place of growth. It had tested them, had pushed them to their limits, but in the end, it had shown them just how strong they truly were. And with that strength, they could face anything. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Kathy felt ready. Ready to move on, ready to embrace the future, and ready to leave the past behind. The house was gone. The evil was gone. And in its place, there was only them. The night air had grown colder as they walked further into the unknown, the road stretching out like an uncharted map ahead of them. With every step they took, the weight of the past seemed to lessen, though Kathy could still feel its presence like a ghost lingering just behind her. The whispers were gone, but the silence was deafening in its own way. like the world itself was waiting for them to speak, to make sense of everything they had just endured. Kathy glanced over at George, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the moonlight. He had his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something in the distance. The quiet was unnerving, but it also gave them the space they needed to think, to breathe. "Where do we go from here?" Kathy asked quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice felt strange after so many days of tension, of whispering voices and endless fear. Now there was only the stillness between them. George's eyes met hers, his expression thoughtful, but filled with the same uncertainty that had been in his voice earlier. "I don't know," he said softly. "But wherever it is, I know we're doing it together." His words were simple, but they held more weight than anything else he could have said. Kathy squeezed his hand, knowing that he was right. Whatever came next, whatever this new chapter in their lives would be, they would face it side by side. Together, they had already survived the worst. As they walked, the road seemed to open up before them, leading them through dense trees, past fields of tall grass, and into the distant horizon. The house, the nightmare, all of it seemed to fade further behind them, becoming nothing more than a distant memory. It was like a bad dream, one that, although vivid, would eventually fade with the light of day. But still, the question lingered. What would they do now? The house had consumed so much of their lives, their thoughts, their actions. Even now, as they stood outside the boundaries of that nightmare, it was hard to fully shake the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting for them to make one wrong move. "Do you ever wonder if it'll come back?" Kathy asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Not the house, but whatever was inside it. The force, the evil. What if we just outran it? George stopped walking, and Kathy followed suit, both of them standing under the pale moonlight. His gaze was distant, as though he were considering her words carefully. "I've thought about it," he said finally. "A lot. But I think that's what we need to do, Kathy. We need to stop running. And not just from the house, but from the fear, from everything that holds us back. If we keep letting it control us, if we keep thinking it will come back, we'll never really escape. It won't ever be over if we're always looking over our shoulders." Kathy nodded, slowly absorbing his words. The house had taken so much from them, but it was only a house. It was only a place. The real power had been in their fear of what was unknown, of the shadows lurking in the corners of their minds. If they could face that, if they could stand firm against the darkness inside them, they would be free. Free to live again. "I guess we have to make a choice, don't we?" Kathy said softly, her voice filled with resolve. "Either we let it control us forever, or we take control back." George nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made Kathy feel like they were standing at the precipice of something life-changing. "Exactly. We can't let it win. Not anymore." And in that moment, Kathy realized something. Their battle wasn't just with the house, with the figure, with the evil that had haunted them. It was with themselves. The house had been the manifestation of everything they feared, everything they couldn't control. But now they had the power to choose. They had the power to define their future, to leave the past behind, and take ownership of the lives they still had left. The weight that had hung over them for so long, that constant dread and anxiety, seemed to lift just a little. Not entirely. Not yet. But the fact that they were still standing still, walking, still moving forward, meant they had already won more than they realized. "We're not going back," Kathy said firmly, looking George straight in the eyes. "We're moving forward, and we'll face whatever comes next together." George's smile was small but genuine. Together. They resumed walking, this time with purpose, the road ahead no longer something to fear, but a journey to embrace. The moonlight bathed them in its pale glow, the world seeming to open up before them as the night stretched into the horizon. There was still uncertainty, still fear, but it wasn't the kind that paralyzed them. It was the kind that was inevitable, that came with being human. And with it came the courage to face it head on. Kathy glanced back one last time at the dark outline of the house. It seemed smaller now, distant, a fading memory. The shadows that had once filled it were gone, replaced by the quiet peace of the night. Whatever had happened in that house, whatever darkness had consumed them, was behind them now. And as they moved forward, Kathy felt something new inside her, a sense of peace, of quiet strength, of hope. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the quiet landscape, and for the first time, Kathy and George felt like they could breathe again. The oppressive weight that had once hung over them had dissipated, leaving room for something new, something fragile, yet powerful. Hope. The night around them was still the only sounds, the soft rustling of leaves in the trees and the distant croak of a frog in a pond nearby. The silence felt different now, no longer ominous, no longer the eerie hush that had once signaled the presence of something lurking just beyond their awareness. This silence was peaceful. It was the calm after the storm. As they walked side by side, their footsteps no longer tentative, but sure. Kathy couldn't help but reflect on everything they had been through. They had fought the darkness in ways they never thought possible, had faced the house, the figure, and the terror that had consumed them. And yet, here they were, still standing, still moving forward. But even with that victory in mind, a part of her wondered, was it truly over? The house, with all its malevolent energy, had been defeated. Yes, the whispers, the shadowy figure that had haunted them, it was all gone. But Kathy still couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted inside her. That darkness had left a scar, one that would take time to heal. Could they ever really be free of it? Could they ever fully leave the terror of that place behind? But then she looked at George. He was walking beside her, not just as a partner, but as a survivor. Together they had faced the horrors that no one should ever have to endure, and together they had come out stronger. Whatever had been waiting for them, the fear, the darkness, the thing that lived inside the house, it hadn't broken them. They had survived. And that in itself was something worth celebrating. "I think we've earned a break," Kathy said with a smile, glancing at George. "Don't you?" George looked over at her and smiled back, his eyes warm, tired, but full of relief. "We have, haven't we?" He let out a soft laugh, and for a moment, it was as if everything from the past few weeks had evaporated. "I think we could both use some time away from all this darkness." Kathy chuckled. "Definitely. I think a place with a lot of sunshine, maybe some warm sand, sounds like a good idea." George nodded. "A vacation. Somewhere far from all of this." They walked on in silence for a few moments, the weight of the past still lingering between them, but no longer suffocating. Kathy felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, peace. The kind that wasn't fleeting, that wasn't overshadowed by dread or terror. It wasn't something that could be destroyed or taken away. It was theirs. The road ahead seemed endless, but Kathy no longer feared what lay beyond. They had been through the unimaginable, and now they had the strength to face whatever came next. "We'll keep moving forward," she said softly, her voice more confident now together. "No more looking back." George's hand found hers again, their fingers intertwining naturally. Together, he agreed, squeezing her hand gently. "We've got this." And as they walked step by step toward the future, Kathy felt a quiet certainty settle in her heart. The evil of the house had been defeated. The figure that had haunted them, the house that had trapped them, it was all in the past. What lay ahead was uncertain, yes, but it was theirs to define. Together they would face it, and whatever came their way, they would stand side by side. For the first time in so long, Kathy allowed herself to feel something she had long forgotten: hope. The kind that came not from the absence of fear, but from the strength to face it, to walk through it, and to move forward. The road ahead was long, but it was theirs to walk. And for the first time, Kathy didn't need to look back. As the road stretched ahead of them, the stillness of the night enveloped them, yet it no longer felt suffocating. Instead, it was peaceful. The kind of silence that came after a storm when the winds had died down and the world was breathing again, slowly, steadily. Kathy kept her focus on the path ahead. She didn't want to look back. Not yet. She didn't want to see the house again, the place that had been both their prison and their battleground. It was gone now, its power broken, and she refused to let it linger in her mind any longer. The road was new, full of possibilities, full of unknowns, but it was a road they could walk together, and that was all that mattered. George was still by her side, his presence a steady anchor in the sea of uncertainty that had once overwhelmed them. His hand, warm and firm in hers, reminded her that she wasn't alone in this. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. That much was certain. "How do you feel?" George asked, his voice gentle, breaking the silence between them. Kathy glanced up at him, meeting his eyes. There was concern there, but also something else, something she hadn't seen before. It was as if he too had changed. The man who had walked through the hell of the house beside her was stronger now, more grounded, more certain of what they could do together. "I feel different," she said softly. "I don't know if it's just because it's over, or if it's because we've finally beaten it. But I don't feel that weight, not like before. It's like I can breathe again." George smiled, the relief in his eyes mirroring her own. "I feel it too," he said. "I guess we didn't just survive it. We came out stronger." There was a long pause between them, a moment where the world seemed to stop turning just for an instant. Kathy could feel it, the calm that had settled in her chest, the quiet strength that had replaced the fear. They weren't broken anymore. They were whole. "I don't know what's coming next," Kathy continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I know we'll handle it, whatever it is, together." George gave a small nod, squeezing her hand as they continued walking down the road. "We've been through the worst. The darkness tried to take us, but it didn't. And now we have a chance. A real one." Kathy could feel it. A new beginning. It was like standing on the edge of a new chapter 1, where the past wouldn't haunt them, one where they could finally live without fear. It wasn't just about leaving the house behind. It was about what lay ahead, the possibility of something better, something beyond the nightmare they had endured. The moon overhead bathed the world in its pale light, casting long shadows on the road beneath their feet. It was quiet here, peaceful, but Kathy couldn't shake the thought that they were being watched. Not by the house, not by any evil force, but by something else, something inside her. Was it fear? Was it caution? Or was it simply the awareness that they hadn't just survived, but were now finally learning to live again? "What do you think life's going to be like after this?" George asked, his voice low but thoughtful. Kathy smiled softly, a small, hopeful smile that reflected the strength she had found within herself. "I think it's going to be different," she said. "But that's okay. I think we're going to make it. We've already faced our worst fear. Now. We'll face everything else together." They walked for a long time in silence, their steps falling into a rhythm, the distance between them and the house growing greater with every step. The road was long, but it wasn't the road that mattered. It was the journey they had taken, the victory they had won, and with each passing moment, Kathy could feel herself shedding the last remnants of fear of doubt. The house was in the past, but the strength they had found, the bond they had forged, would carry them into whatever came next. "I think we've earned the right to move on," George said after a while, breaking the silence again. "To really live." Kathy nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Yeah, we have." And as they walked together into the night, Kathy realized something important. The darkness had tried to take them, tried to consume them whole, but they had survived. They had faced it head on and come out the other side stronger than ever. And no matter what came next, no matter what challenges lay ahead, Kathy knew they would face them together. The nightmare was behind them. The road ahead, though uncertain, was theirs to travel. And for the first time in a long time, Kathy didn't feel the weight of fear in her heart. She felt free. The air was still the moonlight, sharp and bright overhead, casting long shadows on the road. The weight of the past, of the house, of the horrors they had endured, felt lighter with each step they took. The road before them stretched on, endless and full of promise. Kathy couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for the quiet that now filled the air, for the absence of the whispers, the oppressive presence that had once haunted their every thought. The house was behind them, and with it, the darkness that had clung to their lives. They had made it out. And now, for the first time, the future felt like something they could shape, something they could live for. "Do you think we'll ever go back to the house?" George asked, his voice quiet, but filled with curiosity, as if testing the waters for something he hadn't dared to confront until now. Kathy stopped walking, her hand still in his, and turned to face him. For a moment, the road before them seemed to vanish, the quiet of the night wrapping around them like a cocoon. She thought of the house, of the darkness, of everything they had endured. Could they ever truly escape? Could they forget? But even as the thought lingered in her mind, she realized that it didn't matter anymore. The house was a chapter in their lives, a painful one. Yes, but it had shaped them in ways they would never fully understand. They had been through the worst and had survived. That was what mattered. "No," she said softly, her voice steady. "We don't need to go back. We've left it behind, and that's where it stays." George nodded, as if he needed to hear those words as much as she did. He squeezed her hand gently, his expression one of quiet relief, but also determination. "Then we move forward. No looking back." Kathy smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in ages. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the shadows to creep up on her again. The road ahead was theirs, and that was enough. The night was quiet again, the sound of their footsteps blending into the stillness of the world around them. The stars twinkled high above, and for the first time, Kathy could feel the vastness of the world, its beauty, its potential. They were small, yes, but they were together, and that was all that mattered. "We've made it," Kathy said softly, as if to herself, but loud enough for George to hear. George smiled, his eyes meeting hers, full of understanding and warmth. "We have." They walked in silence for a while longer, the road winding ahead, endless and full of possibilities. There was no telling what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Kathy felt ready to face it. Whatever came next, she knew they would face it together. They had faced the worst, and now they had the chance to build something new, something beautiful, something that would never be overshadowed by the darkness of the past. And as they walked into the quiet night, Kathy allowed herself to believe, truly believe, that the nightmares were behind them. They had survived, together. And that made all the difference. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale crescent that seemed to watch over them, casting a soft light on the road ahead. The darkness that had once consumed them seemed so far behind, and Kathy felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. There was no rush to get anywhere now. There was no looming danger, no fear of what might be lurking just out of sight. The world felt open, full of promise. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't known in so long. Even as she walked beside George, her mind wandered to all the places they might go, all the new beginnings they could create. She imagined a home, a place where they could find comfort, a place that was theirs, and theirs alone. A place untouched by the shadows of the past. George seemed to feel it too. His hand was warm in hers, and every so often he glanced at her with that same quiet expression of relief. They had both come through the fire. They had both survived the worst, and now they had the chance to build something new together. "I've been thinking about what you said," George said, breaking the silence between them. Kathy looked up at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "What's that?" "You're right," he said, his voice soft but sure. "It's not just about escaping the house. It's about not letting it control us. We can't keep running from it, from the fear. We've faced it. We've survived it. And now we're free." Kathy nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "That's the key, isn't it, freedom? We were trapped by it, by the house, by the fear of what it might do to us. But now we've taken back control. We've earned it." George stopped walking and turned to face her fully, his eyes meeting hers with a kind of quiet intensity. "We don't have to live in fear anymore. We can build a life, a real one, a future that's not shaped by the past." Kathy's heart swelled at his words. They had been through so much together, more than most people could even imagine. But it hadn't broken them. It had only strengthened them. "I think we're already doing it," she said softly, her voice full of conviction. "We've made it through the worst, and we're still here. We've built something, even in the darkest of times. We've built each other." George smiled, his eyes full of warmth. Together, they stood there for a moment, the world around them quiet, as if waiting for them to make the next step. The road ahead was still long, still uncertain, but for the first time, Kathy didn't feel the weight of it. She felt hopeful. It was like the darkness had been a storm, and now, after everything had passed, the world was clear again. Bright, full of possibility. "We've come a long way," Kathy said, her voice barely above a whisper. George nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "We've been through hell. But now we have the chance to make something good." The road stretched on ahead of them, winding through the quiet landscape, leading them into the unknown. The past was behind them, and the future, though uncertain, was something they could create together. Kathy could feel the weight of it lifting with every step they took. The fear that had once clung to her like a shadow was gone. The house, the figure, the endless whispers, they were behind them. And in their place was a new sense of purpose. They had faced their darkest moments and come through the other side. The road was long, but they would face it together, and that was all they needed. As they continued to walk into the night, Kathy allowed herself to feel what she hadn't felt in so long: peace. They had survived the worst, and the future was now a place full of hope. And for the first time, she believed it. They could finally live. The night stretched on as they walked, the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet, the only sound accompanying them. Kathy felt an odd sense of detachment from the world around them, as though she had entered a new space entirely. a space where nothing could touch them anymore. The wind rustled gently through the trees, the air crisp and fresh, the weight of their past slowly dissolving into the quiet of the world. But with each step, the sense of peace began to feel more real, more tangible. They weren't running anymore, not from the house, not from the darkness. They were moving forward, truly forward, and the world ahead seemed to open wide in front of them. George's hand remained in hers, a constant reminder of the strength they had drawn from one another. She could feel the warmth of his touch, the steady beat of his heart, and it filled her with a sense of security that for so long had seemed impossible. "Do you ever think about what's next?" George asked, breaking the silence once again. His voice was calm, but there was a certain curiosity in it, as if he were trying to gauge her thoughts, his mind full of the same questions that had been drifting through her own. Kathy looked over at him, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "What do you mean by next?" she asked softly. "I think we've faced enough next to last us a lifetime." George chuckled, but there was an edge to his voice, as though he was pondering something much deeper than he was letting on. "I guess I mean, what comes after everything we've been through? I know we can't just pick up where we left off. We're different now." Kathy nodded slowly. "We are different. But that doesn't mean we're broken. We've learned something through all of this. We've learned what really matters." She paused for a moment, considering her next words carefully. The house, the darkness. It was all a test of who we are, of what we're capable of. And we passed. We're still standing, still walking, and that says everything. The road ahead, it might be uncertain, but we've already faced the worst, and that's more than most people can say. George was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. Then he nodded, his eyes softening. "You're right. We've been to hell and back, and we're still here. That counts for something." Kathy's gaze shifted toward the horizon, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to break through the dark sky. The stars were fading, and the world was beginning to wake up around them. For the first time in so long, Kathy felt a sense of peace settling in her heart, quiet and steady. They had survived. They had defeated the darkness. Now they had the chance to live truly live. "I think we've earned the right to live for ourselves now," Kathy said quietly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "We've spent so much time fighting, surviving. But now it's time for something more. For us. For what we can create together." George squeezed her hand, a smile crossing his face. "I like that idea." They continued walking side by side as the day began to break. The road ahead was still long, but now it felt different. It wasn't a road of fear and uncertainty. It was a road of possibility, of new beginnings. Every step they took was a step away from the house, from the terror, and towards something more hopeful, more alive. Kathy didn't know where this road would lead them. She didn't know what the future held. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't afraid anymore. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, and now they had the chance to live freely, to create something beautiful out of the wreckage. As the first rays of sunlight bathed the world in a soft golden glow, Kathy smiled, feeling the warmth of the new day wrap around her like a promise. The nightmare was behind them, and ahead was a future full of choices, full of chances, to be happy. "Together," Kathy said softly, as if making a vow. George turned to her, his face full of love and determination. "Always," he replied. And with that, they walked forward into the day, into the future, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it as one. The sun slowly climbed higher, its light casting a warm golden hue over the road ahead. The quiet world around them seemed to breathe in unison with the promise of a new day. Every step they took felt like a small victory, a quiet declaration that they were no longer prisoners of the past. The house, the darkness, the terror, they were all behind them now. Ahead of them, there was only possibility. Kathy glanced over at George, her heart light in a way it hadn't been in so long. He was looking ahead, his face relaxed, no longer shadowed by the fear and uncertainty that had defined so much of their journey. For the first time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for something to follow them. And neither was she. "Do you think it will ever really leave us?" Kathy asked quietly, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop it. Even now, with the house behind them and the sunlight ahead, there was a part of her that couldn't fully let go of the fear that had once consumed them. It was as though that darkness had been woven into their very souls, and no matter how far they walked, it would always be there lingering. George's expression softened as he turned to her, his eyes filled with understanding. He knew the weight of her question, the quiet worry that still lingered beneath her words. But there was a calmness in his gaze, a quiet reassurance that she hadn't seen in him before. "I think," he began, his voice steady, "that we'll carry pieces of it with us. But I don't think it has to control us anymore. We've already faced it. We've already survived it. And what we have now, what we've built, is something that's stronger than anything that came before." Kathy's heart fluttered at his words. There was truth in them, deep and undeniable. They had been tested in ways most people would never understand, and they had come out the other side not broken, but whole. They had fought for their freedom, fought for each other, and now the road ahead was theirs to walk. Together, she said, her voice soft but resolute. She had always known it, but now in this moment it felt more real than ever. Together they could face anything. George smiled, the warmth in his eyes reaching all the way to her heart. Always. They kept walking their steps, falling into a rhythm that felt natural, effortless. The world around them seemed to embrace them, the landscape unfolding with gentle ease. It was the world they had fought to reclaim, the world they had won back from the darkness. The road stretched on, winding through quiet fields and forests, past homes with glowing windows, past people going about their lives unaware of the battle that had been fought, unaware of the nightmare that had once threatened to swallow them whole. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was the road ahead, the choices they could now make, the future they could finally claim as their own. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows on the ground, but Kathy didn't mind. The shadows didn't scare her anymore. The darkness that had once controlled their every move was gone. And in its place was light, real, tangible light that filled the world with warmth and possibility. "Where do you think we'll go next?" George asked, breaking the silence, his voice filled with curiosity and a spark of hope. "What do we do now?" Kathy took a deep breath, the scent of fresh air filling her lungs. She didn't know the answer to that question, not yet. But she knew one thing for sure. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The house, the figure, the terror. They were all parts of the past chapters. They had closed lessons they had learned. But the future was theirs to shape. "I don't know," she said with a smile, the uncertainty no longer frightening her. "But I think we'll figure it out. Together." George nodded, his eyes filled with that quiet strength that had been forged in the fires of everything they had faced. Together, they continued walking step by step toward whatever awaited them. The future was uncertain, yes, but they had already survived the worst. They had conquered the darkness. And now, with each new step, they were creating something new. Something good. The road stretched ahead of them, winding toward a horizon that was filled with hope. And with each step, they took the weight of the past seemed to fade just a little more. They had earned this peace, earned the chance to live without fear. And now, they would make it theirs, together. The quiet continued to envelop them as they walked the world around them, a soft, steady hum of life. The sunlight, now fully risen, bathed everything in a golden glow, casting long, gentle shadows that stretched across the road. It was the beginning of something new. A new day. A new chapter. A chance to move forward without the weight of the past hanging over them. As they walked, Kathy felt the shift inside her, the lingering tension in her chest slowly unraveling. It wasn't just the house they had left behind. It was the fear, the constant dread that had followed them for so long, pressing in on them from all sides, suffocating them with its cold grip. It was gone now, and with its absence came a strange sense of relief. George walked beside her, his stride strong, his gaze forward, but his presence was unwavering. There was no longer a question in his eyes, no uncertainty. They had made it. They had survived. And now they were moving forward, one step at a time. It wasn't easy. The scars of what they had gone through, the darkness they had faced, would never fully fade. But it didn't need to. It had shaped them, had made them stronger. And now it was a part of their story, a chapter they could close without fear of it consuming them again. For the first time, Kathy let herself breathe deeply, freely. She didn't have to look over her shoulder anymore. The road ahead was theirs to take. "What do you think we'll do when we find a place?" George asked, breaking the silence, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think we'll settle somewhere? Or are we still figuring it out?" Kathy smiled softly, her thoughts drifting to the future. "I think we'll figure it out. We don't have to rush. We have time now. We can find a place, a real home, not one haunted by fear or darkness. A place we can call our own." George nodded. The lines of stress that had once marked his face now softened. A real home. I like the sound of that. As they continued to walk, Kathy realized that it wasn't just the physical space that mattered. It was the freedom they had found, the freedom from fear, from the dark force that had once tried to break them. The house had been a prison, but they had broken free. And now, the world was theirs. The journey ahead was still unknown, but Kathy didn't feel that old sense of dread anymore. She wasn't looking for a way to escape. She was moving forward, and for the first time, the future felt full of promise. There would be challenges. Yes. Life was never simple, never without its hardships. But she had faced the worst and come through it stronger. She glanced at George, seeing the same resolve in his eyes. They had done it. Together they had faced their greatest fears, and they had overcome them. "Wherever we end up," Kathy said, her voice steady, "it will be ours. We'll make it ours." George smiled, the warmth in his eyes deepening. Together, he repeated, his voice filled with quiet strength. Together. It had always been the key. As the day wore on, the world around them seemed to open up in ways they hadn't imagined. The endless road ahead was no longer a symbol of escape. It was a symbol of opportunity, a chance to build something new, something real. And the road, though, long felt less daunting now. They had survived the darkness. They had fought their way out, and now they had the chance to live without fear, to create a future that was all their own. As they walked, Kathy allowed herself to imagine it, the life that awaited them, one filled with light and love, untainted by the shadows of the past. It was a life that they would build together, step by step. They had the strength. They had each other. And that was all they needed. The world stretched out before them, vast and wide, and for the first time it was full of possibility. They were free, and that more than anything was what mattered. The landscape around them, seemed to shift as they walked, the world unfolding with each passing step. The fields stretched out on either side, dotted with the occasional tree or distant house, but the open expanse only served to amplify the feeling of freedom that had begun to settle in their hearts. The sky above, now a brilliant blue, seemed to carry the weight of the world's possibilities, with it endless and waiting. Kathy felt the warmth of the sun on her face, the cool breeze against her skin, and she realized how long it had been since she'd truly felt at peace. The terror, the constant fear that had gripped them for so long was gone. In its place was something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in ages. Hope. She glanced over at George. His face was illuminated by the light, and the lines that had once been etched with worry and exhaustion seemed softer now. His eyes, though still carrying a trace of caution, also held something else, something she recognized as the beginnings of a new chapter. They were free, truly free, and that freedom held an immense weight, not of burden, but of possibility. We've come so far. She said, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. I don't think I ever realized just how much we were carrying. Until now. George looked over at her, his expression thoughtful. It's hard to see the weight when you're in the middle of it, he said softly. You don't realize how heavy it is until it's gone. They continued walking in silence for a moment, the world around them vibrant and full of life. The simple beauty of it, the sounds of birds, the rustling of the trees, the gentle breeze that moved the grasses in rhythmic patterns, was something Kathy hadn't appreciated before. It was as if after everything her senses were finally awake again, taking in the world as it truly was. Do you think we'll ever feel normal again? She asked after a while, her voice almost hesitant. Or do you think we'll always carry pieces of what we went through with us? George's hand found hers again, his fingers intertwining with hers in that familiar grounding way. I think we'll always carry pieces of it, he said. But I don't think that's a bad thing. It's part of who we are now. It's what made us stronger. But I also think that doesn't have to define us. We've made it through the worst, and now we get to choose what comes next. Kathy nodded slowly, taking in his words. It was true. They had faced something unimaginable, and while the scars would always be there, they were no longer trapped by them. The future was theirs to shape. And with George by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. I think we've earned the right to choose, Kathy said quietly. Choose who we want to be, what kind of life we want to create. Exactly, George said, his voice firm but filled with hope. This is our life, and it's not about what we've been through. It's about what we choose to do with the future. They continued walking the road, winding ahead of them. There were no more dark figures looming in the distance, no more shadows hanging over their heads. The house, the terror, the evil, they were all in the past now. What mattered was the life they could build, starting now, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. Kathy found herself smiling, a real, full smile that reached her eyes. She didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid to walk it. The darkness was behind her, and the light ahead seemed endless. George smiled back at her, his eyes sparkling with the same sense of peace she felt. We'll figure it out, he said. Together, Kathy squeezed his hand, a quiet affirmation that she knew they would. No matter what came next, they would face it as they always had, side by side. And for the first time in a long time, Kathy truly believed that the future was something she could embrace. With George, with the strength they had built together, There was nothing they couldn't face. They had survived the darkness, and now they would make their own light. They kept walking step by step into the unknown, but this time the unknown didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something to look forward to. The nightmare was behind them. The future was ahead, and together they would make it their own. As the last rays of the setting sun bathed the landscape in a soft golden hue, Kathy and George continued down the winding road. The world seemed to breathe with them. The rustling leaves in the trees, the chirping of crickets, all creating a symphony of life that felt like a celebration of their newfound freedom. Kathy's heart, which had once been weighed down by the horrors they had endured, now beat with an unfamiliar rhythm, a steady, hopeful pulse that spoke of a future full of possibilities. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she didn't need them. The future didn't need to be a well-defined path. It could be a journey, one they walked together. George looked at her, a gentle smile tugging at his lips. "Do you remember when we first got to the house? How everything felt? Like it was about to fall apart at any moment." Kathy's smile was bittersweet as she nodded. "How could I forget? It was like stepping into a nightmare that wouldn't let us go. I thought we were never going to escape. But we did," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. "And we're not just escaping anymore. We're moving forward. We're building something new." Kathy squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of those words sink in. Moving forward. Building something new. It's funny, she said, her voice soft but steady. "I used to think the hardest part was surviving it. But I think the hardest part is living after. After the nightmare ends, when you have to figure out how to put the pieces back together and live again." George nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's like you can't just pick up where you left off. You have to rebuild yourself piece by piece, and sometimes it feels like you're doing it without a map. But I think that's the beauty of it. We get to choose how we rebuild." Kathy stopped walking for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't realized just how much of herself she had lost in the chaos of survival. The fear, the constant fight to keep the darkness at bay, it had consumed so much of her. And now, with that gone, she found herself facing a blank canvas. A new beginning. And that was both terrifying and liberating. "I think we've been so focused on surviving that we haven't really thought about what comes after," Kathy said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "What do we do when we don't have to fight anymore?" George stopped beside her, his expression softening with understanding. "We live," he said simply, as though the answer was so clear, so certain. "We choose. We make the most of it. We choose each other every day. And we choose what makes us happy." The simplicity of his words hit Kathy like a wave. For so long she had been running from the darkness, fighting to keep it away, thinking that was the key to survival. But now she realized it wasn't just about surviving. It was about living. It was about choosing to be free. Choosing to build something beautiful out of the ashes of everything that had once tried to destroy them. "I like that," she whispered. Choosing each other, and in that moment, Kathy understood. The house, the terror, the evil, they had tried to break them. But they hadn't succeeded. They had survived. They had found each other in the darkness, and now they had the chance to make something real, something lasting. Together, George smiled, pulling her closer as they resumed walking down the road. Together, he agreed. "We've been through the worst and we're still standing. That's worth something." They walked in silence for a while, each step carrying them further from the house, further from the nightmare, and closer to something new. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Kathy no longer feared the unknown. The past had shaped them, yes, but it did not define them. They had the power to choose what came next. The landscape around them was changing, the fields giving way to distant hills and valleys, and Kathy couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. The world was so much bigger than the house had ever allowed them to see, and now with every step she was rediscovering the world, rediscovering life. The road, like their journey, would never be perfect. There would be twists and turns, moments of doubt and unexpected challenges, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. As they walked into the fading light, Kathy felt a sense of peace settle into her bones. It wasn't the peace that came from escaping a nightmare. It was the peace that came from choosing to live again, from taking control of their future, from walking into the unknown, not with fear, but with hope. "You know," Kathy said after a while, her voice lighter, "I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what happens next." George looked over at her, his face full of affection and warmth. "Me too," he said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." And for the first time in a long time, Kathy felt something she had long forgotten, a sense of belonging. Not to a place, not to a house, but to a person. To George. To the life they were building together. A life full of choices. A life full of hope. And no matter what came next, she knew they would face it side by side. The road stretched before them, winding and uncertain, but Kathy felt no fear. The past, with all its darkness and terror, seemed to fade further with each step they took. With George by her side, the unknown was no longer a thing to dread. It was a challenge to embrace. The horizon, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, promised a future filled with possibility. They had survived the nightmare, and now they had the power to shape their own destiny. As the shadows grew longer, Kathy allowed herself to picture a life beyond the horrors they had faced. A life where the past was a chapter, not a weight. A future built on their strength, their love, and the unwavering bond they had forged in the fire of their shared struggle. It was a future where they could choose each other every day, a future where they could choose happiness, peace, and the freedom to live without fear. "Do you think we'll ever find a place?" George asked, his voice breaking through her thoughts. His gaze was distant, but there was a hopeful glint in his eyes, one that matched Kathy's own quiet optimism. Kathy smiled, her heart light with the promise of what lay ahead. "I think we will. A place where we can finally breathe, where we can build something real." She paused, considering his question. "We've already found that in a way. It's not the place that matters. It's what we make of it, what we make together." George nodded, the quiet strength in his eyes reflecting the weight of their journey. "Together," he echoed, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "Together." The word had become a cornerstone of their lives, a reminder that no matter how dark the past had been, they had each other. They had made it through the worst of it, and now they would face whatever came next as one. They continued walking their pace, steady, their hearts full of quiet resolve. The road was still long, but the fear that had once haunted their every step was gone. In its place was something stronger, a sense of hope, of possibility. With every step, the world seemed to open up before them. For the first time in a long time, Kathy didn't feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. She felt lighter, freer, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The house, the terror, the figure, it was all behind them now. The only thing that mattered was what they did next. The road ahead led into the unknown, but it no longer felt like a threat. It was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to live again, and together they would make it theirs. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Kathy turned to George, her heart full of gratitude and love. "We've made it," She said softly the words, feeling like a truth that had finally found its place in the world. We've come so far. George smiled at her, his expression one of quiet pride. And we're just getting started. They walked on the world around them, bathed in the soft light of the evening. The road was theirs to travel, and they would face it together every step of the way. The house was gone. The darkness was gone. And what remained was a future full of hope, full of light, and that was all they needed. The path ahead was no longer daunting. Every step they took felt like they were leaving more of the past behind, until all that remained was the promise of what could be. The weight of their previous lives, shaped by fear and darkness, had all but vanished, replaced by the endless possibilities of a world that could now be remade piece by piece. Kathy found herself thinking less about what had happened to them and more about what they could create from this moment forward. The darkness, the house, it was all in the rearview mirror, fading fast. It was time to embrace the future, and with George by her side, that future felt open, vast, and full of hope. As they continued walking, Kathy glanced over at him. He had his usual calm demeanor, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now, a quiet confidence that had grown from the struggle they had faced. They had both been tested, pushed to their limits, and yet they were still here, still moving forward. It's hard to believe sometimes, Kathy said, her voice soft, her thoughts spilling out before she could stop them. That all of it, the house, the darkness, it really happened. George gave her a knowing look, his eyes reflecting the same thoughts. I think that's the point, he said, his voice steady. It happened, and it's behind us. But the fact that we're still standing here moving forward means more than anything else. Kathy smiled, the truth of his words settling deep within her. They had endured something no one should ever have to face, and yet here they were, stronger together, free. What mattered now wasn't the past. What mattered was the road ahead, the life they could build. I'm proud of us, Kathy said, her voice full of quiet pride, for everything we've been through, for everything we've survived. George stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her, his expression softening. I am too, he said. But it's not just about surviving anymore. It's about living. Kathy nodded. Living without fear, without the weight of the past. Just living. Together. George smiled, the kind of smile that spoke volumes. Together. As the sun dipped further below the horizon, casting long, stretched shadows on the road, Kathy felt something shift inside her. The journey was far from over, but they had already won. They had survived the worst of it and had come out stronger, united. The house, the terror, it had been a chapter in their lives. And now that chapter was closed. Ahead of them, the world seemed to stretch on forever, wide open, ready for them to explore. The uncertainty of the future didn't scare her anymore. They had learned that whatever came next, they would face it as they always had, side by side. George held out his hand, his gesture simple, but filled with the strength of everything they had been through. Kathy took it without hesitation, the familiar warmth of his hand grounding her in the present, in the moment. Together, they were unstoppable. Oh, we don't have to look back anymore, Kathy said quietly. The darkness can't touch us now. George squeezed her hand gently. No, it can't. We've learned what it means to be free. They began walking again, the road before them still winding, but this time it didn't seem so uncertain. They were creating their own path now, not defined by what had come before, but by what they chose to do next. They had survived. They had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. And now, together, they would create a future that was full of light. With every step they took, they were writing a new story. One where they were no longer defined by their fears, but by their strength, their love, and the endless possibilities of the life they could build. And for the first time, Kathy felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The nightmare was behind them, the future was ahead, and together they would make it their own. The road ahead twisted and turned, but each curve seemed to bring them closer to something new, something real. Kathy and George walked side by side, not just as survivors, but as two people who had fought together and had emerged stronger. The world around them was full of life, now alive with possibilities that had once seemed distant, unreachable. But now, after everything they had been through, nothing felt impossible. With every step, Kathy could feel the weight of the past slipping further away, replaced by a quiet confidence. The house, the fear, the darkness, they had been real, but they were no longer a part of their story. The present and the future belonged to them now. She glanced at George, who had remained quiet, his hand still clasped firmly around hers. He seemed deep in thought, but there was something about the way he looked at her that spoke of peace, of contentment. They had both been changed by the horrors they'd faced, but they had also found something greater, a love that had been tested and had come through unbroken. "What do you think life will be like now?" Kathy asked, her voice filled with wonder and curiosity. It wasn't fear or uncertainty that lingered in her heart anymore. It was the desire to create something real, something beautiful, after all the pain. George's voice was steady, but filled with warmth as he looked at her. "I think life will be what we make of it," he said, his words resonating deeply with Kathy. "We've been through a lot, but we've learned how to choose each other, how to choose hope, and how to choose happiness. We have the power to build something beautiful." Kathy smiled, the weight of his words sinking into her heart. She didn't need to know all the details of what the future held. What mattered was that she and George were in this together, facing whatever came next with strength, courage, and love. They walked on the world around them, alive with the quiet symphony of nature. Birds chirped in the trees, a light breeze rustled the leaves, and the soft murmur of a distant stream could be heard in the background. The night, though still young, held a sense of calm that made Kathy feel like everything was finally falling into place. No longer burdened by the past, they had the freedom to shape their own path. The house, the fear, the terror, they were gone. And what was left was a blank canvas ready for them to fill with the story of their lives. "I don't know what's next," Kathy said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "but I know we'll be okay. We're stronger now." George nodded, squeezing her hand, his eyes warm and steady. "Together we can handle anything," and Kathy realized that it was true. The darkness had tried to break them, but it hadn't. The house, the evil, it was all in the past. They were free, and that freedom was theirs to build upon. The road continued to unfold before them, and Kathy felt no fear. Not anymore. Not now that she had found peace. The road might not be straight. It might twist and turn. But she knew they could handle whatever came next, because they were together. As the stars began to twinkle above them, the cool night air brushing their skin, Kathy couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here, for the house that had tested them, yes, but had ultimately led them to this moment. A moment where they could move forward not as victims of the past, but as creators of their own future. And with George beside her, she knew they would make that future whatever they wanted it to be, together. The night deepened around them as they continued on their journey, the stars overhead shining brightly like distant promises, guiding them forward. The quiet was soothing now, no longer oppressive, but peaceful. It felt as though the entire world had paused just for a moment, allowing them to breathe, allowing them to live. Kathy couldn't remember the last time she had felt this free, this unburdened. The shadows of the house were far behind them, its dark presence fading with every step they took. They had survived. They had fought, bled, and struggled, but they had come through it together, and now it was time to build something new. She glanced at George, his face bathed in the soft glow of the moonlight. He looked more at peace than he had in a long time. There was no more tension in his posture, no more wariness in his gaze. The road ahead was not a place of fear anymore. It was a place of possibility. "Do you think we'll ever truly forget it?" Kathy asked quietly, her voice full of reflection. George's gaze softened as he looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "I don't think we'll ever forget, but that doesn't mean we're defined by it. It's a part of us, yes, but it doesn't control us. We get to choose what we do with it. We've learned. We've grown." Kathy nodded, absorbing his words. "I don't want to forget exactly, but I want to move on. I want to live without always feeling like the shadows are right behind me." "You will," George said, his voice steady, sure. "We will. We've faced the darkest parts of ourselves, and we've come out stronger. And now, we get to live." They walked on the night, wrapping around them like a warm blanket the road before them, stretching long and endless. But this time, the road didn't feel like a path of survival. It was a path to something more, to something meaningful. The horizon ahead began to glow with the first hints of dawn, the sky shifting from deep indigo to pale lavender, and Kathy felt a flicker of something new in her heart. Hope. True hope. The kind that came from knowing that the past had shaped them, but it no longer held them captive. They were free, and the future, whatever it held, was theirs to create. They reached a quiet clearing, the road widening into a small, peaceful grove. A few birds fluttered among the trees, and the soft murmur of a nearby stream added to the tranquility of the moment. Kathy paused, taking in the beauty of the world around them. It felt different now, cleaner, fresher, as if they had left behind more than just the house. They had left behind the fear that had consumed them. "This feels right," Kathy said softly, looking around at the grove, her voice filled with awe. "This feels like a place where we can begin again." George smiled and nodded. "It does. I think we've found it. A place where we can build what comes next." Kathy closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the fresh, clean air. She could feel the weight of the past slipping away like sand through her fingers. And in its place was the feeling of something new, something pure. She turned to George, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with the emotion she couldn't quite put into words. "For everything. For standing by me. For fighting with me." George's eyes softened and he reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I'll always stand by you, no matter what comes next." And in that moment, Kathy knew that no matter where the road led, they would face it together. The darkness, the evil, it was all behind them. The house, the terror. It was just a chapter. A hard chapter, but one that had taught them how strong they were. And now they had the chance to write the next chapter of their lives. George pulled her close, and Kathy let herself lean into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace, the strength of his love. It was a love forged through struggle, through pain, and yet it was stronger for it. They had survived together, and that meant they could face anything. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the first rays of the sun broke over the horizon, casting a soft light over the world around them. The past was gone, and the future was theirs to create. They would build it together, step by step, day by day. And for the first time, Kathy felt ready. ready to embrace the world, ready to live. The darkness had tried to take them, but they had survived. And now they were free, and that more than anything was what mattered.